What's up, guys? Welcome to Watch Harry. We've got something special today. What if Harry walked into Gringotts at age 6 and Goblin Healer found 34 tracking charms Dumbledore never removed? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The boy who wandered. The summer Harry Potter turned 6, he learned 3 things about himself. The first was that he could make things happen without touching them. He discovered this in March, when Dudley had cornered him behind the garden shed with a stick and genuine malice in his piggy little eyes, and Harry had wanted so badly for something to stop it that the garden hose had uncoiled off its hook and sprayed Dudley directly in the face with cold water. Harry had stared at the hose. The hose had dripped. Dudley had screamed for his mother. That had been a very bad week. The second thing Harry learned was that his aunt and uncle were afraid of him. Not the bullying kind of afraid, not the kind Dudley tried to manufacture by sitting on smaller children. This was a quieter, uglier fear, the kind that lived behind Aunt Petunia's eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, the kind that made Uncle Vernon's neck go red and mottled whenever Harry asked a question that had no ordinary answer. They weren't afraid for him. They were afraid of him, and they hated themselves for it, and they transferred both feelings onto Harry with considerable enthusiasm. The third thing Harry learned was that something was wrong with him. Not wrong in the way his aunt and uncle said, not freakish wrong, not waste of space wrong. Wrong in the way a compass needle is wrong when it keeps pulling towards something that isn't north. There was a tugging behind his eyes that never quite went away. A warmth in his chest that flickered whenever he was near old things, stone things, things that had been built to last. And sometimes, in the very early hours of the morning when number 4 was quiet and the streetlight leaked orange through the gap in his cupboard door, Harry could feel something in his scar. Not pain. Not exactly. More like the memory of pain, wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. He didn't tell anyone about any of this, because he had learned very early that telling people things gave them something to take away from you. The day Harry wandered into Gringotts started the way most days that changed everything did, quietly, and without any particular intention. It was a Tuesday in July, hot and flat and bright, the kind of day that made the suburban streets of Little Whinging feel like a painting someone had done quickly and without much care. Aunt Petunia had taken Dudley to some kind of summer enrichment program. Enrichment, Harry had turned the word over and over, because he could not imagine what Dudley might be enriched by that wouldn't result in property damage, and Uncle Vernon was at work, and the woman next door who was supposed to check on Harry every few hours had not checked on Harry even once. Harry had eaten the heel of a bread loaf and half a tin of beans he'd heated on the stove by standing on his step stool. He was good at the stove. He'd been doing it since he was 4. He'd sat on the back step and looked at the garden and tried to think about nothing, which was something he was also good at, or had taught himself to be. But the tugging behind his eyes was particularly bad today. Pulling. Insistent. Like a fishhook through the soft tissue of his thoughts, not hurting exactly, just directing, and after 20 minutes of sitting on the step and trying to ignore it, Harry had gotten up, put on his shoes, Dudley's old ones, 3 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper at the toe, and walked out the front gate. He hadn't known where he was going. That was the honest truth of it. He'd just walked, and the tugging had settled into something more like guidance, and the guidance had led him to a bus stop, and at the bus stop there had been an old woman with a carpet bag who smelled of something strange and sweet and not unpleasant, and she had looked at him with very sharp eyes and said, "Diagon Alley, is it, little one?" And Harry, who had never heard those words before, had said, "I think so." And she had patted his hand and given him exact change for the bus and told him which stop to take, and that had been that. He never saw her again. He thought about her, sometimes, in the years after, and wondered if she'd been sent, or if she'd just been kind, or if those two things were the same. Diagon Alley overwhelming was the wrong word. Overwhelming suggested that Harry was failing to cope. Harry was coping beautifully. He was simply processing more information per second than he had ever been asked to process in his short and quietly miserable life, and his body's response to this was to go very still in the middle of the cobblestone street while the magical world moved around him like water around a stone. There were owls. There were stacks of owls, in cages in a window to his left, and they regarded him with the collective dignity of creatures who had decided long ago that the affairs of humans were mostly beneath notice but occasionally worth observing. There was a shop full of robes in the colors of things that didn't have names in the normal world, deep colors, old colors. There was a man walking past with a cage containing something that appeared to be a compass with wings, and behind him a woman whose hat had a small but determined phoenix embroidered on it that kept ruffling its feathers. There was laughter coming from somewhere above, and the smell of sugar and hot copper and old paper, and the sound of someone haggling in a language Harry didn't know over something Harry couldn't see. And ahead, at the end of the street, rising white and irregular and impossible, was the bank. Harry walked toward it the way you walk toward something you've been moving toward your whole life without knowing it. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just steadily, with the tugging in his chest finally going quiet the closer he got. The goblin at the door looked down at him with the particular expression goblins reserved for humans who were either very important or very lost, and was visibly uncertain which category applied. Harry met the look without flinching, not because he was brave, but because Dudley Dursley's version of menacing had recalibrated his threat responses fairly early, and said, politely, "Good morning. I'd like to come in, please." The goblin studied him for a moment. Then it stepped aside. Inside, Gringotts was all height and shadow and the distant sound of money being counted. The ceiling went up further than Harry could comfortably track, chandeliers hanging like frozen fireworks, their light old and gold and steady. The floor was pale marble veined with something dark that might have been metal. Behind the long counter, goblins worked with absolute concentration at tasks Harry couldn't quite make out, moving with the brisk authority of people who have never once doubted that what they were doing mattered. Harry stood in the entrance hall, taking it in, and noticed, because Harry always noticed things, it was the one advantage of spending a lot of time invisible in other people's houses, that several of the goblins had looked up from their work and were watching him. Not the way people usually watched him, which was with irritation or apprehension or the careful blankness that adults deployed when they wanted to pretend a child wasn't there. They were watching him the way the old woman at the bus stop had, with that sharp particular attention, as if he were a word they almost recognized in a language they hadn't spoken in years. Harry walked up to the nearest counter. The goblin behind it had gray that shot through its dark hair and eyes that were the color of old flint. It looked down at him with an expression that gave away nothing. "I think," Harry said, because the tugging had guided him here and he trusted it, even if he couldn't explain it, "there's something wrong with me. And I thought, maybe here would know." A silence, very brief, during which the goblin's expression did something complicated and rapid that Harry couldn't read. "Your name," the goblin said. It wasn't quite a question. "Harry. Harry Potter." The counting sounds of the bank went on. The chandeliers held their light steady. 3 tellers had stopped working entirely and were watching openly now. The goblin at the counter looked at Harry for a long moment with those flint-colored eyes, then looked past him at someone or something Harry couldn't see, then looked back. "Come with me," the goblin said, and lifted a section of the counter, and Harry walked through. The room they brought him to was not like the public areas of the bank. It was smaller, stone-walled, lit by flameless lamps that gave off a cool blue-white light, and it smelled of herbs Harry didn't have names for and something sharp and mineral, like the inside of a geode. There was a chair in the center of the room that was too large for Harry but had been fitted with a cushion, and there were instruments on the walls that Harry couldn't identify, things made of crystal and copper and dark wood, some moving slowly, some still. The goblin who had brought him, who had given the name Sharp Fong when Harry asked, in a tone suggesting this was a reasonable question, stood to one side. 2 other goblins had come in behind them. One was young, or young for a goblin, which meant it looked roughly 45 by human standards, and wore a long coat the color of dried blood with something embroidered on the lapel in thread that caught the light strangely. The other was small even for a goblin, ancient, with a face so lined it looked geological, and it stood very still in the corner and watched Harry with eyes that were the most unsettling shade of amber Harry had ever seen. "Sit," said the one in the embroidered coat. Harry sat. I am Healer Bloodstone. I am going to perform a diagnostic evaluation. This will not hurt. You may feel warmth, or a slight tingling. If you feel pain, say so immediately. A pause. Can you tell me your date of birth? July 31st, Harry said. 1980. Bloodstone's hands stilled briefly over the instrument they'd lifted from the wall. How did you come here today? I walked. And a bus. He thought about it. Something pulled me here. It's been pulling for a while, but today it was loud. Bloodstone and Sharpfang exchanged a look. The ancient goblin in the corner made a sound so quiet Harry almost missed it. I'm going to place this instrument near your head, Bloodstone said, holding up something that looked like a tuning fork made of pale crystal. It will not touch you. It reads magical signature and identifies foreign enchantments. Do you understand? You're going to find out what's wrong with me, Harry said. We are going to find out what is in you, Bloodstone said, with a precision that Harry would come to understand was characteristic. Whether that constitutes wrong is a determination we will make together. Harry nodded and held still. Bloodstone brought the crystal near his temple, and the room changed. It started as a hum, low, felt more in the chest than heard, and the crystal began to glow. Pale at first, the color of moonlight, and Harry sat very still the way he'd learned to sit still in the cupboard when things outside the door were bad, still and quiet and attentive, keeping track of everything. The hum deepened. The crystal's light shifted, went gold, went something between green and gold that had no good name. Bloodstone's face was entirely professional, entirely controlled, and then, the crystal went red. Not a bright red. A dark red, deep and saturated, the color of something organic and wrong, and it pulsed with it, once, twice, and then a third time, and then it stayed that color and the hum from it climbed in pitch until Harry could feel it in his back teeth. Bloodstone lowered it. The color faded. The hum stopped. The silence in the room was of a specific and terrible quality. It was the silence of people who have discovered something they already suspected was there but had hoped, quietly, they were wrong about. Sharpfang, Bloodstone said, very quietly, fetch the director. Sharpfang left without a word, moving faster than Harry had seen him move before. Harry looked at the ancient goblin in the corner. The ancient goblin looked back, and something in the amber eyes was, not sympathy, exactly, but recognition. Something that said, I see you. I know what it is to carry things that were put in you without your consent. Is it bad? Harry asked. Bloodstone set the crystal down on a shelf with unusual care, like something that had just earned more respect than it had held this morning. It is complex, the healer said. I will not lie to you. You deserve a direct answer, but the direct answer requires me to complete the assessment. Will you allow me to continue? Harry considered this. At 6, he had already developed the habit of evaluating whether adults were asking for permission or performing the act of asking for permission, and he was fairly sure that Bloodstone was actually asking. Yes, he said. Bloodstone worked for the better part of 20 minutes. Harry sat still and watched and catalogued. 2 more instruments came off the wall. A large flat piece of crystal that Bloodstone pressed gently to his scar, which went so dark it was almost black. Something that looked like a pendulum that swung in complicated patterns over his chest and arms and the back of his neck, and occasionally stopped it swinging and stayed pointing in a specific direction for a few seconds before resuming. Harry tracked the places where it stopped, both wrists, his sternum, his left shoulder blade, behind his right ear, the soft inside of his right elbow, the base of his skull. He didn't feel most of it. That was possibly the most frightening thing so far, that all of this was apparently inside him, and he couldn't feel any of it, which meant it had been there long enough to feel like normal. Bloodstone finished and went very still for a moment, back to Harry, facing the shelf of instruments. Then turned around. I am going to write down what I have found, the healer said. And then I am going to tell you, and the director, all of it. At once. So that the telling only happens one time. A pause. That is how I prefer to work. Do you object? No, Harry said. He paused. Can I have some water? Something shifted in Bloodstone's face. The smallest thing. Gone before Harry could name it. Yes, the healer said. Of course you can. The director arrived 8 minutes later. His name was Ragnarok, and he was the most important goblin in Britain, a fact Harry would learn later but could infer now from the way the room changed when he entered it, the way Bloodstone stood fractionally straighter and the ancient goblin in the corner gave a small precise nod that seemed to carry substantial weight. Ragnarok was neither the oldest nor the tallest goblin Harry had seen today, but he had the kind of presence that has nothing to do with size, the kind that comes from having made a very large number of very consequential decisions and been right about enough of them to keep being allowed to make more. His eyes were dark and sharp and he wore a jacket the color of midnight with small bone buttons, and when he looked at Harry there was a moment of assessment so swift and thorough Harry felt almost audible. So, Ragnarok said. Harry Potter. Hello, Harry said. Ragnarok pulled a chair to face Harry's and sat down, which struck Harry as significant. He hadn't asked Harry to stand, hadn't made Harry come to him, had come and sat level, eye to eye. You came in on your own today. Yes, sir. Walked off Privet Drive. Harry blinked. You know where I live? Gringotts knows where every account holder lives, Ragnarok said. You have been an account holder since shortly before you were born. Your parents set up a trust vault for you in 1980. He let Harry absorb this. You have never been to access it. I didn't know it existed. No, Ragnarok said, and the word held something in it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sorrow, but occupied the territory between. You did not. He looked at Bloodstone. Tell us. Bloodstone read from the assessment with the calm, meticulous precision of someone who has committed to not flinching, and gets through the catalogue by force of professional will. Tracking charms, 34. Of these, 21 were of standard ministry-grade design. 7 were of a more complex weave, the kind used historically by the Department of Mysteries. 4 were of a design Bloodstone described as antique, pre-ministry, consistent with enchantments used in the early to mid-20th century by individuals with knowledge of blood and proximity magic. 2 were fresh. Applied within the last year. Loyalty-binding hexes, 3. Mild, but cumulative and compounding. Each one a small pressure, a gentle nudge, nothing that would feel like compulsion, everything that would feel like preference. Preference for certain authority figures. Tendency to defer. Tendency to trust. Tendency to minimize one's own concerns in the face of someone else's needs. Emotion suppression weaves, 6. Targeted specifically at fear responses, anger responses, and, Bloodstone paused, for the first time, just briefly, at the neural pathways most associated with seeking help from trusted adults. Not suppressed entirely. Just, muffled. Dimmed. Made to feel like something you might be overreacting to. A block on his magical core, partial, subtle, the kind that didn't prevent magic from happening but shaped the outflow, controlled the pressure, kept it from building toward anything that might attract attention or concern. And in the scar, something that was not a charm. Not a curse in any conventional sense. Something that Bloodstone described with careful precision as, an anomalous magical signature, non-native, consistent with a fragmented soul construct anchored to the tissue. The room was very quiet. Harry had drunk his water. He was sitting with his hands in his lap looking at Bloodstone, and he had understood approximately 70% of what the healer had said, and of that 70% he had understood enough. Someone put all of that in me, Harry said. Not a question. Yes, Bloodstone said. When I was little. The earliest charms in the array date to approximately 3 to 6 months after your birth, Bloodstone said. Several were applied in stages. It was a process, not a single event. Who? Harry asked, and the word was very quiet and perfectly level, and Ragnock, who had been watching Harry's face throughout with the practiced attention of someone who has spent a lifetime in negotiation, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "That is what we must determine with certainty before we can state it," Ragnock said. "But you think you know." A pause that was 1 second too long to be nothing. "We have significant evidence," Ragnock said, suggesting the identity of the individual who placed or authorized the majority of these enchantments. "We will not state that name until the evidence is complete and the legal ground is sound. What I can tell you is this: it was not your parents. Your parents' magical signatures are in the Gringotts records. None of the enchantments found today match either of them." Harry looked at him steadily. "Is whoever did this trying to hurt me?" Ragnock considered his answer for a moment in a way that made Harry think he was choosing between several honest answers rather than between truth and a lie. "Not in the conventional sense," he finally said. "The design suggests control, rather than harm. Shaping, rather than damaging." Another pause. "The intention does not change the impact. What was done to you was done without your knowledge or consent, to a child who had no capacity to refuse. In Goblin law, and in several of the older wizarding statutes that predate the current ministry structure, this constitutes a significant violation." "Would they do it to someone else?" Harry asked. "Is there someone else like me?" The question landed differently than Harry had meant it to. He'd meant it practically, tactically, the way he always thought about problems at home. If someone is doing something wrong, are they doing it to more people, and should I be worried about those people? But in the silence that followed, he could see it had landed somewhere deeper in the room, somewhere that made Bloodstone set down the parchment and Ragnock lean back with an expression that Harry would, years later, identify as respect. "That," Ragnock said slowly, "is an excellent question, and yes. We will look into it." He looked at Harry for a long moment. "How are you feeling?" Harry thought about it honestly. He did this as a practice, checked in with himself the way you check whether a flame is still lit, quick and regular. He felt strange. He felt light in a way that was slightly alarming, the way you feel when you've been carrying something on your back for so long that the moment it's lifted you don't trust the absence, can't stop bracing for the weight. He felt, not frightened. He'd been frightened enough in his life to know the texture of it. This was different. This was the feeling of a door that has been locked for as long as you can remember suddenly, silently, standing open. "Confused," Harry said. "And like I have a lot of questions." He paused. "And hungry. I only had half a tin of beans today." The silence after that was of a different quality than all the previous silences. This one was smaller and sharper. Ragnock looked at him. "You were fed half a tin of beans this morning and sent on your way. I made them myself. They didn't know I left." Harry said it without complaint, entirely factual, and that factual quality was in some ways harder to sit with than tears would have been. "Is the trust vault, can I use it? For food and things?" Ragnock stood up. "Sharpfang," he said, "have the kitchen send up a proper meal. Then, to Harry, you will eat, and while you eat I am going to make several communications that are time-sensitive. After that, we will talk about what happens next." A pause. "I want you to understand something, Harry Potter, before we go further. What happens in this room today, who is told, what actions are taken, what course is set, you will be part of those decisions. Not decoratively. Actually. You walked in here on your own. That matters. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Harry looked at him. "You're saying it's my choice." "I'm saying it is your life," Ragnock said, in a tone that brooked very little argument with the principal. "That should have always been true. We are late getting here. But we are here." Harry thought about the cupboard, and the hose water, and the way Aunt Petunia's eyes went when she was frightened. He thought about the tugging that had brought him here, and the way it had gone quiet the moment he sat down in this room. He thought about 34 tracking charms in a 6-year-old's body, and the soul fragment in his scar, and the fact that someone had done all of this in stages, not once but repeatedly, over months, planning it the way you plan something you intend to maintain. "What do I need to decide first?" he asked. The meal arrived while Ragnarok was still in the adjoining office. Harry could hear the low rumble of his voice through the stone wall, speaking in gobbledygook too quickly for Harry to do anything but note the rhythm and urgency of it. Sharpfang brought the tray himself, set it on a small table someone had brought in, and stood back. The food was not what Harry was used to, which was mostly bread and leftovers and whatever could be assembled quietly in a kitchen where he was tolerated rather than welcomed. This was actual food, proper food, roasted chicken and bread and something that might have been potatoes cooked in something deeply savory, and a glass of pumpkin juice which Harry had never had before and which tasted like an autumn afternoon. He ate without talking, because he needed the quiet. The ancient goblin, he still hadn't learned that one's name, was still in the corner, and he glanced at it occasionally, and it glanced back, and this went on in the easy comfortable silence of two beings who understand that sometimes the most honest company is the kind that doesn't require either of you to perform. Bloodstone was writing. The quill moved quickly, precisely, with the scratch and rhythm of a complete professional report being constructed in real time, and Harry watched the healer's hands and thought about the word anomalous, non-native, consistent with a fragmented soul construct, and ate his chicken and filed it away in the part of his mind he'd trained to hold things for later consideration. He was 6 years old and he was very small for his age, because nutrition had always been a tertiary consideration in number 4, and he was wearing his cousin's cast-off clothes and shoes stuffed with newspaper, and he had 34 enchantments in him that someone had put there deliberately while he was too young to know, and there was a piece of a dead or dying evil man anchored to the scar on his forehead, and he was sitting in Gringotts eating the best meal of his life in the company of goblins who were, for reasons he hadn't fully worked out but intended to, treating him like someone whose existence and opinion mattered. Harry cleaned his plate, drank the pumpkin juice, and set the glass down carefully. "What's your name?" he asked the ancient goblin in the corner. The amber eyes regarded him. Then, in a voice like dry parchment and old stone, "Gravel Stone." "How long have you worked here?" "Since before your grandparents' parents were born," Gravelstone said, with the serenity of someone for whom this is simply a logistical fact. "Are you going to help figure out what to do with me?" Gravelstone was quiet for a moment. "I am the institutional memory of this bank," the old goblin said finally. "When a situation arises that has no recent precedent, they bring me in to find the old ones." The amber eyes moved to the scar on Harry's forehead with a look of focused, ancient recognition. "There is precedent for what was done to you. There is also precedent for what can be done about it. I am here to remember both." Harry nodded slowly. "Good," he said. The door opened and Ragnarok came back in, and behind him, to Harry's considerable surprise, came a woman. She was tall, with close-cropped steel-gray hair and a monocle she wasn't currently wearing but had clipped to the collar of her robes, which were the dark navy of someone who worked in something official. She had the face of a person who had made up her mind about most things a long time ago and reviewed those decisions periodically and stood by them. She looked at Harry the way Ragnarok had looked at him, assessing, direct, without performance. "This is Amelia Bones," Ragnarok said. "She is the head of magical law enforcement at the ministry." "Hello," Harry said. Amelia Bones looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled up a chair, turned it around, and sat with her arms folded over the back, looking at him with an expression that was professionally neutral and underneath that, in the place where professional neutrality didn't quite reach, deeply and carefully furious on his behalf. "Ragnarok tells me you walked in here this morning and sat down in a diagnostic chair and asked to be assessed," she said. "I knew something was wrong," Harry said. "I just didn't know what." "How did you know something was wrong?" Harry considered how to explain the tugging, the compass feeling, the way his scar felt like a mask that didn't fit. "I just did," he said. "I've always felt it. I thought everyone felt it and I was just not good at living with it. But I don't think that's right." Amelia Bones looked at Bloodstone's report, which Ragnarok had handed her on entering, and she read it, not quickly, not skimmingly, but with the focused attention of someone building a case in real time. She turned pages. She stopped at one page for several seconds. She turned back. She finished. "Harry," she said, "I want to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly even if you think the honest answer might cause problems." "Okay," Harry said. "Where are the Dursleys? Does anyone know you're here?" "No," Harry said. "They don't know I left. My aunt took Dudley out and my uncle is at work and the neighbor forgot to check on me." He paused. "I don't think they'll be worried." This landed in the room with the weight of a stone dropped in still water, ripples going out and out. Amelia's jaw moved slightly. Ragnarok's expression was still, but his eyes had gone to something past Harry's shoulder for a moment, the way you look at something when you don't want to look at the thing you're actually thinking about. "They won't be worried," Amelia said, not inflecting it as a question. "They don't like me very much," Harry said. "My aunt, sometimes I think she's sad about it. But mostly I'm not something they wanted." He said it the way you say true things when you've had a long time to sit with them and work out that the truth of it is about them and not about you. Not entirely without hurt, because there was hurt in it, would always be hurt in it, but organized hurt, accounted for hurt. "I don't want to go back there." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to," she said. "Not today. Not immediately." She glanced at Ragnarok. "There are legal frameworks, there are multiple legal frameworks," Ragnarok said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has had a productive half-hour on the communication mirror. "Two of which I have already begun activating. Gringotts has a custody provision under the Family Trust Guardianship Act of 1762, applicable when an account holder minor is determined to be in circumstances detrimental to their well-being. I have asked Gravelstone to confirm the precedents. Additionally, under the Potter family magical inheritance compact, Harry as heir has the right to claim active management of his estate at any age, which places him under Gringotts institutional protection pending the appointment of a legal magical guardian." He looked at Harry. "In short, you can stay here while this is investigated. Legally, formally, with documentation that no one currently has the authority to override." Harry absorbed this. "But someone will try," he said. "Yes," Ragnarok said. "They will. The person who put the charms in me. Almost certainly." "But you said the legal ground is sound," Ragnarok said. "Groundwork is only half of any conflict, though. The other half is will." He looked at Harry steadily. "Do you want to pursue this? All of it? The full investigation? The removal of the enchantments? The legal proceedings? The answers?" A pause. "It will not be simple, or quick, or entirely safe. The individual we believe responsible is powerful and well-connected and very, very good at making himself appear indispensable to the people who would otherwise hold him accountable." Harry thought about the 6 years he had spent being hungry and invisible and told in 100 small ways that his existence was a burden and his feelings were an inconvenience. He thought about 34 charms. He thought about the soul in his scar, pressed up against the back of his head like something waiting to be let out. He thought about his parents, whose magical signatures were in the records, who had set up a vault for him before he was born, who had clearly loved him, and who were gone, and whose going had perhaps been arranged. "Yes," Harry said. It came out quieter than he expected, and stronger. Amelia Bones uncapped a quill and pulled a parchment from inside her robes. "Then we'd better start," she said. "I have a few questions, Harry, and then I'm going to need Ragnarok to walk me through exactly what Bloodstone found, and then I'm going to make some calls that are going to make a few very powerful people very uncomfortable." She paused. "Are you ready for that?" Harry thought about the door standing open after years of being locked, and the way the absence of the weight felt like a risk he was just going to have to get used to. "Yes," he said. "Good. Amelia set her quill to the parchment. Outside, Diagon Alley continued its afternoon business, noisy and bright and ordinary. Inside, in a room of blue-white light and careful instruments, a 6-year-old boy with his cousin's shoes and a scar he hadn't been asked to carry made the first real decision of his life. 34 charms. 6 years of suppression and shaping. One sole fragment wearing his face from the inside. It was going to take more than one afternoon. But they had started. Chapter 2, what the ledger shows. The room they moved Harry to was deeper in the bank, past the public counters and down a corridor that curved in a way that didn't quite match the exterior geometry of the building, a fact Harry noticed and filed away without comment. The walls here were older stone, darker, and the flameless lamps were set into niches carved at irregular intervals that suggested they'd been retrofitted into something that predated the concept of interior lighting by several centuries. The corridor smelled of deep earth and metal and something faintly herbal that Harry would later identify as a preservation charm applied to the stonework every 50 years for as long as Gringotts had existed. The room itself was comfortable, which surprised him. He'd expected something like a waiting room, functional and impersonal. Instead it had a low bed with a wool blanket in dark green, a desk, a window that showed sky, actual sky, which was architecturally improbable given how far below street level they descended, but the light was real and the clouds were moving, and a bookshelf along one wall that held 30 or 40 volumes in a range of languages, some of which Harry recognized and several he absolutely did not. Sharpfang showed him in and said, with the economical communication style Harry was coming to appreciate, dinner at 7. Ragnarok at 8. Sleep if you need it. Then left. Harry stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Then he went to the bookshelf and read the spines. Then he sat on the bed and pressed his palms flat against the wool blanket and felt the texture of it and thought, carefully and systematically, about everything that had happened since he'd walked out of the Dursley's garden gate this morning. He was 6, and he was smarter than people generally expected from a 6-year-old, and he knew this not because he was arrogant about it but because he'd had years of practice being underestimated and had developed a fairly accurate calibration of the gap between what people assumed he understood and what he actually understood. He understood quite a lot. He understood that the situation he was in had moved very quickly from a child wandering into a bank to something with legal frameworks and ministry officials and institutional precedents being cited from memory by a goblin who was older than the concept of indoor lighting. He understood, because he was also 6 and could not turn off being 6, that he was very far from Privet Drive and he had no idea what happened next, and the bed was soft and the blanket was warm and he had eaten an actual meal and he was, without quite meaning to, going to fall asleep. He did. He dreamed of a corridor that wasn't the Gringotts corridor, a different kind of dark, a different kind of stone, and at the end of it something that didn't have a face yet but was working on acquiring one. He could feel it turning toward him the way you feel someone's attention before they speak, a pressure, a weight, a consciousness that recognized his the way one candle flame bends toward another. He turned and walked the other way and the dream changed, went soft and orange-lit, and there was a woman with red hair sitting on the floor of a room he didn't know, laughing at something, and a man with glasses and hair exactly like Harry's leaning in the doorway saying something Harry couldn't hear but could feel, warm, affectionate, the tone of someone saying something privately funny to someone they love completely. Harry stood in the dream and watched and did not move, because if he moved he had the sense it would end, and he did not want it to end. He woke up when someone knocked on the door. The room was dim, the sky window showing early evening, the light going amber. Harry sat up and said, "Come in," and Sharpfang came in with dinner on a tray. "Ragnarok is ready when you are," Sharpfang said. Harry ate, soup, this time, dense and dark and flavored with things he couldn't name but wanted to eat every day for the rest of his life, and thought about the woman with red hair. His mother, he assumed. He had no photos, no stories, nothing. Aunt Petunia would go hard and closed as a fist if the word Lily came anywhere near her, and Harry had stopped trying that door at age 4. But he knew what he'd felt in the dream, and he carried it with him like something cupped in both hands as he followed Sharpfang back down the corridor. Ragnarok's office was large enough to be authoritative and small enough to be functional. Maps on the walls, not decorative ones, operational ones, annotated in gobbledygook with what looked like financial data overlaid on geographical features. A desk that was covered in precisely organized parchments in the way that means the owner of the desk knows where every single thing is and will notice immediately if any of it moves. A fire that burned without wood in a grate of black iron, steady and unhurried. Amelia Bones was there, sitting in one of the chairs facing the desk, and she looked like she'd spent the last several hours doing exactly what she'd said she was going to do, making people uncomfortable. She had the particular energy of someone managing controlled fury in a professional context, which Harry recognized because it was how he felt most of the time at Privet Drive. Gravelstone was in the corner again. Harry was beginning to think Gravelstone might just live in corners. "Sit down, Harry," Ragnarok said, and Harry sat. "You've slept?" "Yes." "Good. What we're about to cover is substantial. I want you awake for it." He pushed a parchment across the desk. "This is a copy of Bloodstone's full diagnostic report. I've had it translated into plain language. The original is in Healer's notation, which takes years to learn to read. That copy is yours. You can read it at whatever pace you need, ask questions at any point." He waited until Harry had it in his hands. "I'm going to walk you through the most significant findings, and Amelia will explain their legal implications as we go. Gravelstone will speak when there is historical or precedent-based information that requires the institutional perspective. Any questions before we begin?" "Who did it?" Harry said. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. "We are going to reach that answer in the proper order," he said. "Not to delay you, but because the answer will mean more when you understand the full shape of what was done. The name without the context is just a name. I want you to understand the shape of it." Harry thought about this and decided it was reasonable. "Okay." Ragnarok began with the tracking charms, because they were the most numerous and the most explicable and, in some ways, the easiest to think about without your thoughts going somewhere you weren't ready for. 21 standard ministry-grade tracking charms. These, Ragnarok explained, were not necessarily sinister in origin. There was a long tradition of tracking charms being applied to high-profile or endangered individuals for ostensibly protective purposes. The issue was that they had never been registered, never been disclosed, and had accumulated over time rather than being applied as a single protective measure, suggesting not protection but monitoring. "You could track someone's location with one of these," Ragnarok said. 2 or 3 would give you redundancy. 21 is surveillance. 21 means someone wanted to know exactly where you were at every moment, with no possibility of any single charm failing and losing the signal. Harry thought about the fishhook feeling, the constant subtle tug. "Is that what I felt?" he asked. "The pulling?" Bloodstone, who had come in quietly while Ragnarok was talking and taken a seat near the wall, looked up from the secondary copy of the report. "The pulling you felt today was different," the healer said. "That was your own magic following an instinct. The tracking charms wouldn't feel like pulling, they are passive, outward-facing. They tell someone where you are. They don't tell you anything." A pause. "The fact that your magic created an instinct strong enough to override the suppression weaves and bring you here today is significant. Your core is stronger than whoever designed the blocks anticipated, even at your age. The 7 complex ones," Ragnarok continued, "are of Department of Mysteries design. We are looking into whether they were applied through official channels or whether someone with access to that department's techniques applied them privately. The 4 antique ones are pre-ministry. They were designed originally for a specific purpose, tracking the movements of individuals who might, theoretically, pose a risk to a pre-agreed social order." Ragnarok's voice was very level. "They were in common use by certain prominent wizarding families during periods in the last century when those families had strong interests in controlling the movements of specific individuals." "You mean they were used to keep track of people who might cause them problems," Harry said. "Exactly so. And 2 of them were applied recently. In the last year. Within the last 11 months, Ragnarok said. After you had been living at Privet Drive for over 4 years. Someone felt it necessary to add to the existing array. His dark eyes were steady on Harry. That suggests active maintenance. Not a one-time action but an ongoing project. The fire burned. Harry looked at the report in his hands. The loyalty hexes, he said. Ragnarok nodded. 3 of them. Mild, individually. Cumulatively, they create a consistent pressure toward deference, particularly toward older authority figures, particularly toward figures who present themselves as knowledgeable and well-intentioned. He paused. Think of it this way. When you meet someone who tells you they have your best interests at heart, how strongly are you inclined to believe them? Harry thought about it honestly. He thought about how hard it was to hold on to skepticism when an adult spoke confidently and with apparent warmth. How even when something felt wrong, there was always a part of him that said, but they're the adult, they know more, they must have a reason. More than I should be, probably, he said quietly. More than you would be without the hexes, Bloodstone said, not unkindly. Your natural skepticism is actually quite sharp for your age, Harry. What you have been experiencing as your own insufficient judgment is in large part the hexes working against your instincts. You have been arguing with your own mind for 6 years and your mind has been losing the argument artificially. Harry sat with that for a moment. It was a specific kind of horrible, not dramatic horrible, not scream and throw something horrible, but the quiet grinding horrible of realizing that the most private thing you own, the thing most incontrovertibly yours, your own way of thinking and deciding and trusting, had been tampered with. Can they be removed? He asked. Yes, Bloodstone said. All of the charms can be removed, with the right approach and the right skill set. The loyalty hexes will take 2 sessions. The tracking charms can go in 1 longer session. The suppression weaves are the most delicate, they are woven into the pathways rather than sitting on top of them, so removing them requires more precision. A pause. The soul fragment is a different matter. That will require preparation and will wait until the rest has been addressed. I won't attempt it until your core is clear and stable. The soul fragment, Amelia said, and her voice had a particular quality, not horror, because she was too practiced for horror, but the controlled version of it, the kind that's been compressed into something functional. Ragnarok, let's address that now. Ragnarok looked at Harry. What do you know about Voldemort? He asked, with no softening of the name. Harry absorbed the slight flinch the name had produced in Amelia, subtle, professional, suppressed almost instantly, and looked back at Ragnarok. He killed my parents, Harry said. And he tried to kill me and it didn't work and that's why I have the scar. My aunt told me they died in a car crash but I knew that wasn't right. It wasn't. They were murdered on October 31st, 1981. In Godric's Hollow. Ragnarok said it simply, because there was no version of it that was made better by cushioning. Voldemort killed your father first and then your mother. When he attempted to kill you, with a killing curse, a spell that has no counter, the curse failed. Rebounded. Left the scar you carry and destroyed Voldemort's physical body. He let that sit. What Bloodstone found in your scar is the reason the curse failed in that specific way. When the curse struck you, it encountered a magical protection your mother had created, a sacrificial protection, very old magic, very powerful. The curse fragmented on impact. Your mother's protection destroyed the intent of it. But a fragment of the caster, a fragment of Voldemort's soul, was already so unstable, so divided by practices he had pursued over years, that the rebounding curse drove a piece of it into the nearest living vessel. Harry looked down at his report. Me. You, Ragnarok said. It was not intentional on anyone's part. It was a consequence of the collision between very dark magic and very powerful sacrificial protection. The soul fragment in your scar is not Voldemort, it is a piece of him, possibly containing memory, emotional resonance, some portion of his power. It has been there since you were 15 months old. It is not sentient in the way you are sentient. But it is not inert. Harry thought about the dream. The corridor, the thing turning toward him with no face yet, working on acquiring one. I dream about it, he said. Bloodstone leaned forward. Describe the dreams. Harry described them, the corridor, the dark, the consciousness that recognized his. He described the way it felt like being looked at from the inside. Bloodstone wrote while he talked, and when Harry finished there was a short silence during which everyone in the room was visibly thinking. It is passive at this stage, Bloodstone said. You are 6 and the fragment is, dormant isn't the right word. Quiescent. It stirs during sleep because your conscious defenses are down and your magic is cycling more freely. It is not trying to communicate with you deliberately. The healer looked at him over the writing. You did the right thing when you describe walking away from it in the dream. Continue to do that. Does it know about me? The things I think and feel? We believe it has access to your emotional register during the quiescent state, Bloodstone said. In plain terms, it may experience echoes of strong emotions. It cannot read your thoughts. It cannot direct your actions. At your age and at its current strength, it is impressionable. Not powerful. A pause. The concern is that if it were to be deliberately awakened or strengthened by external events, by someone attempting to restore Voldemort, the dynamic could change. Harry filed this information in the same place he'd filed the rest of it and moved on. Not because it wasn't frightening, it was, underneath the processing, genuinely frightening in a way he'd get to later when there was space for it, but because frightening things that existed whether you panicked about them or not were more usefully thought about as problems to be solved. Who knows about the fragment? He asked. The silence. Ragnar's, specifically, was the most communicative. It was the silence of someone who has been waiting for this question because it is the question that connects everything. We believe, Ragnar said carefully, that the individual who placed the majority of the tracking charms and suppression weaves is aware of the fragment. The evidence suggests awareness of it since at least a few months after your parents' deaths. He looked at Harry and in his eyes was the acknowledgement of what he was about to say, and the weight of it. The soul fragment is the most likely reason you were placed with the Dursleys rather than any other arrangement being made. Your mother's sacrificial protection is anchored to the blood relationship. Petunia Dursley is her sister, shares that blood, and as long as you live in Petunia Dursley's home, the protection is renewed and the fragment cannot be accessed or strengthened by external forces. Harry followed this to its conclusion. But that protection was also keeping me trapped there, he said. With people who, he stopped. Not because he couldn't say it, but because the precise right words required a moment of selection. With people who were required to take me in but not required to care about me. Correct. And while I was there, someone was putting more charms on me and maintaining the old ones. Correct. So the protection, whoever set this up, they were protecting me and keeping me controllable at the same time. Like keeping something in a cage that also happens to be a safe. Ragnar was very still. Then he said, yes. That is an accurate description. Amelia made a small sound that was not quite words. She had her quill in her hand and she was pressing the end of it against her own palm with slightly too much force, a grounding gesture, something she was doing to keep herself inside her professional register when what was underneath it was considerably less professional. Harry looked at the report in his hands. Tell me his name, he said. Ragnar looked at him for a long moment. The evidence, he said, points to Albus Dumbledore. The name lay in the room. Harry turned it over. He didn't know the name, not really, not with the bone-deep recognition of someone who had grown up hearing it spoken with reverence and weight. He'd never been told the story. He'd never been told anything. But Ragnar was watching his face for the shape of shock, and what he saw there instead was something more like recognition, the child who has always suspected that the person who seems the most trustworthy is the person most worth being suspicious of. He's important, Harry said. You said well connected. The most prominent wizard in Britain, Amelia said, with a voice that was so careful it was almost impressive. Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, the governing body of wizarding law in Britain. Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. A pause. There is no more powerful position in wizarding Britain than the one Dumbledore currently occupies. Several positions, combined. And he decided what to do with me after my parents died, Harry said. He placed me with the Dursleys. He did. And he is the only individual outside of the Potters who had access to your magical signature in early infancy, we believe because he was your parents' secret keeper, and he, Ragnock stopped. Harry looked at him. He wasn't, was he? Ragnock was very still. That, he said quietly, is a question connected to a related but separate case that we will get to shortly. Let me say for now only that the question of who your parents' secret keeper was, and what happened as a result of that, is very much still open, and is one of the matters Amelia's office is formally investigating as of this afternoon. Harry set the report down on his knee. He was aware of the fire, the even light, the maps on the walls. He was aware of gravel stone in the corner, patient as geology. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which was even and functional and was going to stay that way because he was going to need it. Is there money missing? He asked. From my vault. From my family's money. Ragnock's expression shifted slightly. You are quick, he said, and it wasn't flattery, just observation. If someone had control of me and control of where I lived and control of my magical development, Harry said, and they were comfortable using that control, is there money missing? We are auditing the Potter family accounts in full, Ragnock said. It is in progress. What I can tell you at this juncture is that the trust vault your parents established is intact. The Potter family vault, the main estate vault, shows several significant withdrawals over the past 5 years that are not formally authorized by any living Potter heir. He watched Harry. The amounts are substantial. How substantial? In the range of several 100,000 galleons across the 5-year period. Harry looked at him steadily. Who authorized the withdrawals? The withdrawal orders were signed by Albus Dumbledore in his capacity as, Ragnock paused, with the specific precision of someone choosing language carefully, self-designated guardian of the Potter estate. The fire. The maps. Harry's even heartbeat. He put charms on me, Harry said, very quietly. He put me in a house where they didn't want me. He kept me small and controllable and he took money from my parents' vault. He stopped. And he knew about the soul fragment. He knew there was a piece of Voldemort in my scar. Yes, Ragnock said. What was he? What was the plan? What was I supposed to be? Gravelstone spoke from the corner, and the room turned toward the old voice with a kind of gravity. A weapon, Gravelstone said. The old records, the magical theory, the prophecy traditions, the patterns of what was done to you, they are consistent with the preparation of a conduit. Someone who carries just enough of the enemy's power to be used against him, at the right moment, by the right person. The amber eyes were steady on Harry. He who must sacrifice himself to destroy the darkness. It is a very old framework. It has a formal name in several magical traditions, the deathly instrument. The vessel made willing by not knowing it is a vessel. Harry sat with that for a very long time. Outside, somewhere above them, Diagon Alley was going about its evening. Inside, the fire burned at its own pace and the maps annotated their territory, and Harry Potter, 6 years old, small for his age, in his cousin's shoes, understood with complete and terrible clarity what he had been being shaped into. He wanted me to die, Harry said. Eventually. That was always the plan. We believe, Ragnock said, that he intended you to reach a specific moment, carrying the soul fragment, and sacrifice yourself, destroying both yourself and the fragment simultaneously. After which Voldemort, stripped of his final anchor, could be destroyed fully. A pause. We also believe he considered this acceptable. A necessary cost. The greater good. Did he love me? Harry asked. It was a strange question to ask in this context, and he knew it was strange, but it seemed important to get the shape of it right. Not personally. I know he didn't know me. But did he think he did? Think it was love that made him decide to do this? Ragnarok looked at him, and for the first time since Harry had met him today, the director of Gringotts looked like something other than a consummate professional managing a delicate situation. He looked, briefly, like someone sitting across from a child who has asked a question so precisely right that it reframes everything. Yes, Ragnarok said. I believe he did. Harry nodded. That's the most dangerous part, he said. That's what makes it hard. Amelia Bones, who had been silent for several minutes in the particular silence of someone managing a great deal of emotion with a great deal of practice, set down her quill. Harry, she said. I need you to understand what I'm going to do and why, and I need you to agree to it, because you are the subject of this investigation and your agreement matters legally and also, it just matters. She met his eyes. I am going to open a formal investigation into Dumbledore's actions regarding your placement, the enchantments found today, and the unauthorized withdrawals from the Potter estate. I am going to do this under the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which means Dumbledore cannot suppress it, cannot reach it through his Wizengamot influence, cannot bury it. I have 2 senior Aurors I trust completely and they begin tonight. A pause. It will be ugly. It will be loud when it becomes public. He will fight it and he will be convincing and there are a lot of people who love him very much and will not want to believe it. Are you ready for that? Will it keep him from doing this to someone else? Harry asked. Amelia looked at him. That is the intention, yes. Then yes, Harry said. After Amelia left, quickly, purposefully, with the energy of someone who has an enormous amount of work to do and has already started, Ragnarok sat back and for the first time since Harry had met him, appeared to be momentarily at rest. He looked at the fire. Then at Harry. There is one more thing, he said. Separate from the investigation, separate from the enchantments. Something I thought you should know tonight because it affects what we do in the coming weeks. Harry waited. You have a godfather, Ragnarok said. His name is Sirius Black. He is your father's best friend and your parents' chosen guardian for you in the event of their deaths. He paused. He is currently in Azkaban prison, where he has been for the past 5 years. Harry looked at him. For what? He was convicted of the murder of 12 muggles and a wizard named Peter Pettigrew, and of betraying your parents' location to Voldemort. Ragnarok's voice was extraordinarily careful. He was convicted without a trial. The fire. You can't, Harry started. In Britain you can, under specific wartime provisions of the Wizarding Law Act of 1973, be held indefinitely pending trial for crimes of sufficient severity. The provision was intended to last a maximum of 6 months pending full hearing. Sirius Black has now been held under it for 5 years with no hearing date set. Ragnarok let Harry absorb this. I want to be precise, I do not know whether Sirius Black is guilty or innocent. I have seen nothing today that answers that question definitively. What I know is that the absence of a trial is a significant legal irregularity. And I know that under normal circumstances, Sirius Black would have been your guardian. Which means that without him in that role, you were available for other arrangements. Harry thought about the cage that was also a safe. He thought about the greater good. He thought about how quickly and cleanly all the pieces fit together once you laid them out without the loyalty hexes softening your thinking. If he's innocent, Harry said, someone made sure he couldn't be your guardian. Specifically. That is one possibility, Ragnarok said. There are others. But yes. Can we find out? If he's innocent? It will be part of the investigation. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. I want to be careful about giving you too many things to carry at once, Harry. Tonight you have learned enough for 10 adults to process. You do not have to have all the answers tonight. Harry looked at the fire. He thought about the dream, the red-haired woman on the floor, laughing. The man in the doorway. The warmth of it, the realness of it, the sense that these two people had loved each other and him and had died before he could know them and had been betrayed by someone who had then reshaped the story of that betrayal into something he could live with under the name of the greater good. What happens to me tomorrow? He asked. Tomorrow, Ragnarok said, Bloodstone begins the first removal session. The tracking charms come out. You will feel different afterward, lighter, probably, and somewhat disoriented as your magic recalibrates to its natural state. You will need to rest. He paused. I am also going to introduce you to someone. A goblin tutor named Flintrock who teaches contract law, estate management, and the history of magical governance. Not because you need to be burdened with coursework, but because, he stopped, and something in his expression was the closest thing to wry that Harry had seen from him. Because you asked a better question in that diagnostic room this morning than most adult wizards would have thought to ask. Is there someone else like me? That is the kind of mind that should not be left idle. Harry felt something warm and unexpected move through him that was not entirely the pumpkin juice. He looked at Ragnarok and thought about all the adults in his life and the ways they had all, in various ways, found him to be less than expected or more than wanted or simply not the right shape to fit the space available. Why are you doing this? Harry asked. Not challenging, actually curious. Not the investigation, not the legal frameworks. Why personally? You don't have to, you could have sent me home. You could have written a report. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Goblins have a long memory. We remember every agreement broken, every treaty violated, every account raided by someone who thought they had the authority of righteousness behind them. He looked at Harry steadily. What was done to you was done on the assumption that you were a piece in someone else's game. That your life had been weighed against an outcome someone else decided was worth it. His voice was not warm exactly, but it was certain. Goblins find that particular assumption, that one being may decide the value of another's life in the service of their own purpose, deeply, fundamentally offensive. On every level. Philosophically. Historically. Personally. A pause. Besides, you said please. When you asked to come in. The door guard noted it. We do not often hear please. Harry almost smiled. Thank you, he said. That also, Ragnarok said, with the ghost of something not quite a smile, is noted. The second night in Gringotts was quieter than the first. Harry lay in the low bed with the wool blanket and looked at the sky window going dark, star by star, and thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban. He thought about 34 charms coming out of his body one by one like splinters being drawn out of a wound. He thought about the money missing from his parents' vault, withdrawn in careful increments by someone who had decided that the means were justified. He thought about the greater good, and what it meant that a person could love something so abstract so completely that the individual people inside it became granular. Expendable. Not maliciously. Just, mathematically. And he thought about the woman with red hair laughing on the floor, and the man in the doorway, and the particular warmth of people who love each other and don't think to hide it, and he thought, they gave everything for me, and the person they trusted with me decided what I was worth without ever asking me. He pressed his palms against the wool blanket. Tomorrow the first 34 splinters came out. Tomorrow he would start learning what he actually was, without the shape someone else had pressed him into. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the first genuinely free day of his life. He was 6 years old, and he was in the oldest bank in Britain, and the people who had always wanted to control him were about to find out that a 6-year-old they had spent considerable effort making small had walked, on his own instincts, to the one place in the country they had the least power. He closed his eyes. The sky window went full dark. The sole fragment in his scar was quiet tonight, quiescent, and Harry kept his back turned to it in the dream and watched his parents instead. In the morning, he would begin. Chapter 3, The Weight of a Name. The first removal session lasted 4 hours. Harry had expected it to hurt. He'd prepared himself for it the way he prepared himself for most difficult things, quietly, in advance, building a kind of internal architecture that could absorb the impact. What he hadn't prepared for was the way it felt when something that had been inside you so long it felt like you was taken out. Not painful. That wasn't the right word. It was the feeling of silence after sound you hadn't noticed, the feeling of warmth returning to a hand that had been cold for so long the cold had become the baseline. Bloodstone worked with 2 ceramic instruments and a preparation of something silver dark that smelled of deep water and old iron, applied in precise amounts to Harry's temples and wrists and the back of his neck. The healer didn't speak much during the process, the occasional instruction, breathe out slowly, hold still, turn your head left, and Harry obeyed each one without comment, sitting very straight in the chair and watching the instruments glow and dim and glow again as each charm was located, loosened, drawn out. He felt them go, one by one. Some of them came out like exhaling. Some came out like waking up from a dream and not being sure, for a moment, which side of it you're on. 3 of them, the old ones, the antique pre-ministry designs, came out with a sensation he could only describe later as grief, which was strange because you couldn't grieve something that had been done to you against your will, except apparently you could. Apparently the body knew the difference between something alien and something that had become integrated enough to feel like self, and the removal of the latter left a texture of absence even when the presence had been wrong. The 21st charm came out and Harry blinked and the room was very bright. Not physically. The flameless lamps were the same blue-white they'd always been. But something behind his eyes had changed, some film or scrim that he hadn't known was there, and without it the light seemed to have more depth, more information in it, the way music has more information when you're no longer listening through a wall. "Are you all right?" Bloodstone asked. "Yes," Harry said, and his own voice sounded different to him. Clearer. Less like something being received through static. "How many more?" "That was the last tracking charm," Bloodstone said. "The suppression weaves are next but not today. Your core needs to stabilize before we attempt them, 2 days rest, then we continue." The healer was looking at him with that careful professional attention. "How do you feel?" Harry thought about it honestly. "Like someone took the cotton wool out of my ears," he said. Bloodstone set the instrument down and made a note, and if there was something in the healer's expression that went briefly past professional neutrality it was there and gone fast enough that Harry could have imagined it. "That is an accurate description of the subjective experience," Bloodstone said. "The suppression weaves were calibrated to affect sensory processing as well as emotional ones. Your magical perception should begin to clarify over the next 48 hours. A pause. You should be aware that this will make the soul fragment marginally more perceptible during this period. It has always been present. You will simply be less muffled now. If the dreams intensify, come to me immediately." "Will it be able to feel the difference?" Harry asked. "The fragment. Will it know the charms are gone?" Bloodstone considered this. "It is quiescent," the healer said. "But, possibly. Think of it as a sleeper in a room where the ambient noise has changed. Probably it will not wake. But it may shift." Harry nodded and filed this in the problem-to-be-managed section of his mind, which was getting quite full. "Thank you," he said. Bloodstone looked at him for a moment with the amber eyes. He'd realized, sometime on the 2nd day, that bloodstone and gravelstone had the same unusual eye color, the same particular shade, though their apparent ages were wildly different. "You are very good at managing difficult information," the healer said. "Someone taught you that?" "No one taught me," Harry said. "I worked it out." "I know," Bloodstone said. "That is what I mean. 2 days of rest meant 2 days of flintrock, which was not restful but was, in ways Harry hadn't expected, deeply satisfying. Flintrock was a goblin of about middling age, 40 or 50 by human reckoning, he'd later determine, who had the energy of someone perpetually engaged in 3 different interesting projects and only grudgingly interrupted any of them to speak to you. He had a sharp close-cropped look and wore his teaching robes with the focused dishevelment of someone who considers their personal presentation broadly irrelevant and has moved on. He arrived the morning after the first removal session with a stack of rolled parchments under one arm and a box of what appeared to be small mechanical objects under the other, set both down on Harry's desk, looked at Harry, and said, "Ragnarok says you're clever. Let's find out." Harry looked at the parchments. "Is this coursework?" "Not in any formal sense. There is no curriculum. I'm going to give you information and you're going to tell me what it means to you, and we're going to see whether your analysis has any relationship to reality." Flintrock unrolled one of the parchments on the desk. It was a map, not a geographical one, but something more abstract, a diagram of lines and nodes that Harry didn't immediately recognize. "What does this look like to you?" Harry looked at it for a moment. "A family tree," he said. "But the lines run differently than normal ones. These ones here," he pointed to 3 lines that converged at a central node, "they're thicker. More significant. Those represent vaults," Flintrock said. "The nodes are family lines and the lines between them are financial relationships, inheritances, debts, shared investments, marriage compacts. This is the Potter estate map as of 1981. He pulled the parchment and unrolled another under it. "And this is the same map as of 6 months ago." Harry looked between them. The second one was visibly thinner. Several lines had gone dotted, inactive, and the 3 thick lines that had converged at the central Potter node were now all significantly lighter. "Where did the weight go?" Harry asked. "Where do you think?" Harry looked at the map for a long moment. There were arrows, small ones, which he'd initially read as decorative. They weren't decorative. They indicated flow. He tracked them. 3 separate flows, moving from the Potter node outward, converging at a secondary node with no family name attached, just a symbol. "What's this?" he asked, pointing. "That is a discretionary holding structure," Flintrock said. "A legal mechanism used when an estate manager maintains accounts separate from the estate itself, ostensibly for administrative costs, for charitable disbursements, for school fees and welfare expenditure on behalf of the ward." He paused. "Ostensibly. But actually," Harry said. "Actually it is an extraordinarily useful way to move money out of an estate in small enough increments that no single transaction triggers an audit flag, under the legal cover of guardianship duties." Flintrock looked at him. "The structure was established by Albus Dumbledore in November 1981. 1 month after your parents died." Harry looked at the map, at the 3 attenuated lines, at the secondary node sitting outside the family structure and draining from it quietly and steadily for 5 years. He thought about the greater good. He thought about how much a great good required, the administrative costs, the charity, the maintenance of the apparatus that protected the magical world, all of it funded by someone whose parents had trusted the wrong person and hadn't lived to notice. "He needed money," Harry said slowly. "Not personally, he didn't do it to be rich. He did it to fund something. The investigation, the war effort, the whatever project I was part of." Flintrock was looking at him with an expression that Harry was coming to recognize as Flintrock's version of interest, which was more contained than most beings' version but unmistakable once you knew the signs. "Continue," the goblin said. "He decided what I was going to be, the weapon, the sacrifice, whatever he called it in his own head. And that plan cost money and required infrastructure. And the money was there, in my vault, and he was the guardian, and Harry stopped. He thought it was for me. He thought he was spending my money on the thing that was going to save the world, including me, in the end." He looked at Flintrock. "That's right, isn't it? That's how he justified it." "There is a note," Flintrock said, pulling a small folded parchment from the stack, found in the records of the discretionary holding structure, written in Dumbledore's hand. "It reads, expenditures made in service of the boy's ultimate welfare and the welfare of all those the boy will one day protect. Dated November 18, 1981. He handed it to Harry. Harry read it. The handwriting was elegant, certain, the handwriting of a person who has never had cause to doubt their own conclusions. He set it down. He's been telling himself this story for 5 years, Harry said. He probably believes every word. Almost certainly, Flintrock said. Which is, as you identified last week, the most dangerous part. He picked up the parchment and rolled it back up with the economy of movement that was characteristic. The goblin perspective on this, since you may find it useful, we have encountered many humans who do terrible things in full knowledge that they are terrible. They are manageable. We have encountered fewer humans who do terrible things in full, genuine belief that they are right. Those are considerably harder to stop, because stopping them requires not only defeating them but making them understand what they've done, and the mind that is capable of the original act is generally also capable of infinite reinterpretation of the evidence. He looked at Harry levelly. What does this tell you about the coming conflict? That winning the legal case won't be enough, Harry said. Even if we prove everything, even if we show everyone, there will be people who still believe him. Because he believes himself. He sat with this. We need something he can't reinterpret. Such as his own testimony, Harry said. We need him to say it. To actually say, I knew, and I decided, and I thought it was right. Because he will. He won't be able to help it. If he genuinely believes he's right, and he does, he won't be able to stay quiet when the case is made. He'll want to explain. He'll want everyone to understand the reasoning. He looked at Flintrock. And the reasoning will damn him better than any evidence we could present. Flintrock said nothing for 5 seconds. Then, Ragnarok says you're clever. He reached for the next parchment. He may be underselling it. On the afternoon of the second day, with the sky window showing a low September light that suggested the season was genuinely turning, a package arrived for Harry. Not through any delivery system he recognized, it simply appeared on the desk while he was in the washroom, arrived the way things arrived in a place that ran on magic old enough to have its own personality. The package was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string that appeared to have been knotted by someone who found the process irritating, and attached to it was a small card that read, in spiky writing Harry didn't recognize, for the boy in the deep room. These were your mother's. She would have given them to you herself at some point. Sorry it's late. Inside was a small stack of photographs, properly magical ones, the figures in them moving. And a letter, not long, in a different hand, tight and controlled, the handwriting of someone precise and private. Harry looked at the photographs first. His parents, young, much younger than they'd been when they died, in their teens probably, at a school that was clearly very old and very large, wearing robes with a house insignia he couldn't quite make out. His mother was laughing at something off-frame, and his father was watching her with an expression that had the comfortable hopelessness of someone who has known for a long time that this is the person they're going to love and has made their peace with it. There was another one, his parents older, clearly the year Harry was born, his mother sitting in a chair with her hands resting on her very pregnant stomach, looking at the camera with an expression of slightly overwhelmed joy. His father behind her with both hands on her shoulders, looking at the same camera with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and is aware that his inability to believe it does not make it less real. There was one of Harry himself, as a baby, in his mother's arms. He looked at this one for a long time. He looked at his father's face. His own face, smaller and softer, looked back at him across 5 years of distance, and his mother was saying something to him in the photograph, silently, over and over, the word clear on her lips even without sound, hello. Harry sat down on the bed with the photograph in his hands and gave himself exactly 5 minutes to feel it, all of it, the whole weight of it, the grief and the longing and the particular bone-deep unfairness of people who loved you so much they died for it and didn't get to stay. He sat with it completely, because he'd learned that the things you only half feel come back larger, and then he folded it and the other photographs carefully and set them on the desk and opened the letter. It was from his mother. Written when he was about 3 months old, she said, at the beginning. In case, she wrote, with no further explanation of what the case might be, because she was 3 months postpartum and apparently the kind of person who faced the possibility of her own death with directness and no sentimentality. She'd written about his father, James, she called him, just James, with the ease of someone for whom a name is a whole person, and about their house in Godric's Hollow, and about Sirius, who she described as your godfather, the most loyal person I know, which is saying something because your father is also the most loyal person I know and they've been competing for the title since they were 11. She'd written about her hopes for Harry, which were not grand, not that he'd be great, not that he'd be powerful, not that he'd save anything. She'd written, I hope you're happy. I hope you find things that interest you and people who deserve you. I hope you know what you are without anyone having to tell you. I hope you're warm enough. At the end, she'd written, if something happens to us, if you're reading this because something happened, please know that whatever the world tries to tell you about yourself, it doesn't know. We knew. You were the best thing, Harry. You were the best thing we ever did. Don't let anyone make you small. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it and put it with the photographs and sat for a moment looking at the wall. Don't let anyone make you small. She'd written that 3 months after he was born, 2 months before she was killed, and she'd written it like she already knew, like she already had the shape of the worry, the specific fear for him. As if she'd looked at the world around her and seen the mechanisms and known that what they'd want to do to her son, if they got the chance, was make him into something that fit a narrative they'd already written. Harry thought about 34 tracking charms. He thought about loyalty hexes and suppression weaves and the note in Dumbledore's hand about the boy's ultimate welfare. He thought about a cage that was also a safe. He thought, not anymore. The second removal session, 3 days later, was harder. The suppression weaves came out differently from the tracking charms, not in a sequence of discrete removals but in one long, sustained process that felt less like extraction and more like unwinding, the way you'd unwind something that had been wrapped around the structure of a thing rather than simply placed on top of it. Bloodstone had 2 other healers in the room this time, one monitoring a crystal array on the wall and one standing by with a prepared draft of something that smelled of lavender and made Harry feel, when he inhaled it, like standing in a large open space. The 6 suppression weaves came out in order of depth, the shallowest first, then progressively deeper ones, and Harry felt each removal differently. The first 2 were mostly physical, the clarity effect Bloodstone had described, the sense of static lifting. The third one was the emotion suppression, the fear and anger channels that had been muffled, and when it came out Harry spent about 40 seconds feeling the full unfiltered version of everything he'd been managing at a fraction of its actual weight for 6 years, and it was, a lot. It was a lot of anger. It was a lot of grief. He held on to the arms of the chair and breathed through it the way Bloodstone had instructed and didn't try to manage it because that wasn't the instruction was to let it move through, and it did. It moved through him like weather, loud and real and gone, leaving him shaken and very present and more himself than he'd ever felt. The fourth weave, the one on the pathways associated with seeking help, was the one that made him, briefly, cry. Not dramatically. Just quietly, for about 30 seconds, while Bloodstone said nothing and simply continued working and gave the process its due space. Because that one had been there since infancy. That one had been shaping him since before he had language to frame what was being done to him. Every time he'd been hungry and hadn't asked. Every time something had been wrong and he'd concluded internally that it wasn't worth mentioning. Every time he'd been hurt and convinced himself it was manageable, that adults wouldn't help anyway, that making yourself visible in your need was somehow smaller than suffering silently. All of that, not entirely his own conclusion. Not entirely natural. Assisted. Waited. Someone had looked at an infant and decided that a child who learned not to ask for help was a child who wouldn't complicate the plan. He was done crying in about 30 seconds. He wiped his face and held still and let Bloodstone finish. The sixth weave came out last, and when it did Harry felt his magical core settle into something that had the sensation of a chord resolving, not a dramatic surge of power, nothing so cinematic, just the deep correct feeling of something in its natural state for the first time. He breathed in. He breathed out. The room felt different. He felt different. Not larger, not stronger in any way he could point to specifically, just, actual. Like the difference between a photograph and the person in it. "How is your scar?" Bloodstone asked immediately. Harry checked. "Warm," he said. "Not painful. Just, there. More than usual." "Expected," Bloodstone said. "The suppression weaves were damping it along with everything else. Now that they're gone it will feel more present for a few days. Come to me if it becomes painful or if the dreams change character." The healer looked at him with those amber eyes. "How are you?" "Good," Harry said. And then, because it was true and because he was done suppressing things, angry. "But good." Bloodstone nodded. "The anger is appropriate," the healer said. "It should feel like yours now." "It is." The dreams did change that night. Not in the way Bloodstone had warned against, not aggressive, not pain-filled, not the faceless thing in the corridor turning toward him with new intention. Just more present. More detailed. The corridor was longer, the stone more specific, and the thing at the end of it was, not more awake, exactly, but more defined, like something coming slowly into focus. It didn't move toward him. It was still passive, still quiescent. But Harry could feel it better now, the shape of the consciousness that wasn't his, and for the first time he could make out something about its emotional texture. It was lonely. That was the thing that surprised him enough to half-wake him at 2 in the morning. He lay in the dark and turned this information over and tried to decide what to do with it, because you couldn't exactly sympathize with a fragment of the soul of the man who murdered your parents, but you could note the information as relevant without allowing it to become complicated. It was lonely. It was a piece of something that had destroyed itself pursuing power and isolation, and what remained of it, pressed against the inside of a small child's scar, was alone in the most fundamental way possible, separated from everything it had been, from even the limited form of self that remained in the world, and just, waiting. Harry turned his back to it in the dream and walked in the other direction and found his parents. His mother was by the window this time. His father was reading something. Neither of them looked up, and Harry didn't try to make them, just stood in the room and existed near them and let that be what it was. When he woke up the sky window was grey with early morning and he lay still for a minute cataloguing, scar warm but not painful, dreams unsettling but manageable, anger still present but sitting cleanly rather than pressing at everything, the general state of someone who has been through 2 complicated magical procedures in the last week and has processed approximately 3 lifetimes worth of information and is fundamentally, surprisingly, okay. He got up, got dressed, and went to find Flintrock, who he knew was in the East reading room by 7 because Flintrock had the schedule of someone with no patience for sleeping past utility. "Tell me about Sirius Black," Harry said, before Flintrock could begin with the day's material. Flintrock looked at him. "That is not on today's agenda." "I know. Tell me anyway." A pause, during which Flintrock assessed the quality of Harry's intention and apparently found it sufficiently serious to override the agenda. The goblin set down the parchment he'd been holding and crossed his arms and said, "What specifically do you want to know?" "Everything," Harry said. "From the beginning. Not just the arrest. Everything." So Flintrock told him. Sirius Orion Black, born into the oldest pure-blood family in Britain, House of Black, family motto toujours pur, always pure, a motto that Sirius had, according to the institutional records Gringotts held on all major account holders, been in open rebellion against since approximately age 15, when he had been sorted into Gryffindor in defiance of every generation of his family and had responded to their reaction by escalating. He'd been James Potter's best friend from their first day at Hogwarts. He'd been disowned by his family at 16 and gone to live with the Potters, who were, by all accounts, thoroughly pleased to have him. He had been, according to the last will and testament of James and Lily Potter, designated as Harry's godfather and guardian without qualification, reservation, or contingency clause. On November 1, 1981, the day after Godric's Hollow, Sirius Black had been taken into custody by Ministry orders at a scene in a Muggle street where 12 Muggles were dead, and Peter Pettigrew, a wizard and former school friend of Black's, was represented by a single severed finger. Black had apparently been laughing. He had been sent to Azkaban within 72 hours. No trial. No formal hearing. Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, had invoked the emergency detention provisions, and Black had gone in, and the provisions had never been revisited, and Black was still there. Who decided not to give him a trial? Harry asked. Crouch made the initial call, Flintrock said. But it required the chief warlock of the Wizengamot to formally authorize the extended detention provision. A pause. Albus Dumbledore was chief warlock. Harry looked at the East Reading Room wall with its maps and its institutional records going back 3 centuries and let this land properly. He authorized locking away his own student, Harry said slowly. James's best friend. The one person who would have taken me in immediately and never put me in a cupboard and never let anyone put 34 charms in me. Yes, Flintrock said. And then he went and put me with the Dursleys and signed himself in as guardian of my estate. Within the same month. He was tidying, Harry said, very quietly. He was arranging. Making sure everything was in the right place. He couldn't just put me with the Dursleys and hope Sirius didn't make noise from prison, so he made sure Sirius couldn't make noise at all. He put him somewhere that the Ministry didn't look at twice because everyone already knew Black was guilty. He stopped. Except nobody knew that. Nobody actually knew. He was laughing in the street, and that somehow became proof enough to lock him away for 5 years without a question. The magical world was in shock, Flintrock said, not as an excuse but as a historical observation. Voldemort had been defeated the night before. People were celebrating. The capacity for critical thinking was limited. Someone used that, Harry said. Someone knew that the window was right. That people wouldn't ask. That is our assessment, yes. Harry sat with it. Sirius Black, who his mother had described as the most loyal person she knew, who had been his godfather for exactly 1 day before being taken away. Sirius Black, who had been laughing in the street because, Harry thought about this, turned it over, looked at it from the angle of a person who was loyal above all other things and who had just lost everyone, who might have been laughing because what else do you do when the grief is that size? When the person you were supposed to protect is dead and the world is celebrating and you are standing in the wreckage of a life and there is nothing left to do but laugh or scream, and maybe he'd chosen laughing because at least it was his own choice. I want to see him, Harry said. Flintrock went very still. You understand what Azkaban is? Tell me. So Flintrock told him about Azkaban too, and Harry listened to all of it, the Dementors, the effect of prolonged exposure, the way the prison worked not by physical containment alone but by the systematic removal of every positive thought and memory until what remained of a person was mostly the worst things they'd ever experienced, playing on a loop. He listened to all of it and said, when Flintrock finished, how long can a person survive that without losing themselves entirely? It varies, Flintrock said carefully. Some people break relatively quickly. Others, individuals with exceptionally strong senses of self, strong emotional architecture, particularly people with deep and genuine convictions, can hold on longer. He looked at Harry steadily. Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 5 years. We do not know with certainty what state he is in. Some people who go to Azkaban come out, diminished. Permanently. Harry looked at his hands. His mother's letter was in his room on the desk, and he didn't need to read it again to hear it, the most loyal person I know. He'll be holding on, Harry said. He's angry and he's grieving and he's been in there 5 years for something he may not have done, and he is going to be holding on. He looked up at Flintrock. Can we get him out? That is a question for Ragnarok and Amelia Bones, Flintrock said. But the short answer, if an investigation into Dumbledore's actions brings the authorization of the extended detention into question, and if there is evidence that Black was denied due process, then a Wizengamot hearing could potentially be forced. A pause. It would not be quick. And it would require Black himself to be coherent enough to participate. Then we need to go before he isn't, Harry said. Before more time passes. Flintrock looked at him, the way he'd looked at him on the first day when Harry had identified the discretionary holding structure from the arrows on the map. That same contained, slightly surprised quality, the look of someone recalibrating. I will tell Ragnarok you wish to discuss this today, the goblin said. Thank you. Harry pulled the day's parchments toward him. Now show me the next thing. The meeting with Ragnarok happened after dinner, and Amelia was there again, with two people Harry hadn't met, Aurors, he guessed, from the way they stood and the specific professional stillness they had, the quality of people trained to assess threats. They were introduced as Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was the height of a reasonable door and had the measured deliberate quality of someone who had decided long ago that patience was a strategic asset, and Auror Nymphadora Tonks, who was young for an Auror, vivid, and who changed the color of her hair from brown to pink to brown again during the introductions without apparently noticing she was doing it. Tonks noticed Harry noticing and said, Metamorphmagus. I can't always control it when I'm, never mind. Hello. You're very small. Yes, Harry agreed. That's going to be annoying for a while and then it won't be, she said, with the authority of someone who had personal experience of being underestimated. Trust me. Shacklebolt looked at Harry with the careful assessment of someone building a profile. You've been here a week and a half, he said. You're 6. You've learned the full scope of the situation. Yes, Harry said. And you want to pursue it. All of it, Harry said. Sirius Black first. The financial irregularities, the enchantments, all of it eventually. But Sirius first because he's been in there 5 years and every day is one too many if he's innocent. Shacklebolt glanced at Amelia. Amelia looked at Harry with the expression she'd been using since they met, which was the one she wore when she was deciding something not about strategy but about character. Tell me why Sirius first, she said. Not the emotional reason. The tactical one. Harry thought about it. Because if Sirius was locked away specifically to prevent him from being my guardian, and to keep quiet the question of who was actually responsible for betraying my parents, then the mechanism that put him there is the same mechanism that authorized everything else that was done to me. Dumbledore's authorization of the extended detention provision is the clearest, most documented point where his authority was used to remove someone who was an obstacle to his plan. He paused. It's also the one where the evidence is simplest. It's a document. It has a signature. Either it was used appropriately or it wasn't, and given the circumstances, proving it wasn't gets us further than anything else we have, because it establishes a pattern in terms the Wizengamot can't reframe as good intentions. The room was quiet for a moment. Also, Harry added, because it was true and it mattered, because he's been in there 5 years and he was my godfather and if he's innocent he deserves to be free and I want to make that happen. Tonks made a small sound that might have been approving. Shacklebolt said, fair, in a tone that suggested he'd been testing for whether Harry would admit the personal reason, and was satisfied that he had. Amelia leaned forward. Here's where we are on the investigation, she said, and she moved quickly through it, the professional economy of someone working efficiently under time pressure. The enchantment evidence was solid. Bloodstone's report was, per Amelia, the most thorough diagnostic record she'd seen in 20 years of legal work, and it was being reviewed by 3 independent magical assessors whose credibility the Wizengamot would find difficult to challenge. The financial evidence was nearly solid. The discretionary holding structure records were in Gringotts' custody and the withdrawal orders with Dumbledore's signature were documented. The authorization of Sirius Black's detention without trial was a public record that had been quietly sitting in the Ministry archive for 5 years, and all it needed was the right eyes looking at it in the right frame. The problem, she said, is moving quickly enough. Dumbledore doesn't know yet that you're here, not in any official sense. He knows you were absent from Privet Drive as of last week. The tracking charms going dark would have been, he felt that, Harry said immediately. Almost certainly, Ragnarok confirmed. The moment the tracking charms were removed, every monitoring instrument he had keyed to your location went silent simultaneously. He knows you're no longer under surveillance. He doesn't know where you are. How long before he finds out? Harry asked. Depends on how quickly he acts, Amelia said. He can't go to the ministry officially without triggering the very investigation we're conducting. He can't go to Gringotts officially because the moment he presents himself, the conflict of interest in the account irregularities creates a formal legal situation he won't be able to control. His options right now are limited to unofficial channels, and Dumbledore is, he's cautious. He will think before he moves. She paused. But we have days, not weeks. Once he locates you here, the legal battle moves into active terrain, and the Wizengamot is his. He has enough influence to slow everything down significantly. Then we file on Sirius's case today, Harry said. That is what I recommend, yes, Amelia said. And the financial case? Filed simultaneously if possible, Ragnarok said. Combined with the enchantment evidence, submitted to the Wizengamot under seal to prevent Dumbledore from suppressing it in his capacity as Chief Warlock. There is a provision, rarely used, requiring the signature of 5 senior Aurors and the director of Gringotts, that allows a case to be filed directly to the full Wizengamot without passing through the chieftain's desk. I am willing to sign. Amelia? I have 5 Aurors, she said. Including myself. Then we file tomorrow, Ragnarok said. He looked at Harry. When the filing is made, Dumbledore will know within hours. The nature of the charges will become known to the Wizengamot at large within a day, and the media, the wizarding press, will have it shortly after. The story of what was done to you will be public. Your name, your circumstances, the enchantments. He was very direct about it. It will not be comfortable. People will have opinions. Some of them will be ugly. I know, Harry said. That's okay. You're 6, Tonks said, and it wasn't dismissive, it was the opposite of dismissive, it was the careful genuine concern of someone who wants to make sure the plan accounts for the full humanity of the person at its center. I know, Harry said again. It's still okay. It's worse if we wait. He looked at all of them. This isn't only about me. Flintrock said it, this is a pattern. What he did to me, he probably did some version of to other people. Maybe is still doing it. The faster we move, the smaller the damage. Shacklebolt looked at Amelia. Amelia looked at Ragnarok. Ragnarok looked at Harry with those dark, sharp eyes that had been measuring and recalibrating him for the better part of 2 weeks. Tomorrow, then, Ragnarok said. Harry nodded. He thought about the photograph on his desk, his mother saying hello to him over and over in silence, his father watching her with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck. He thought about Sirius Black, 5 years in Azkaban, holding on. He thought about his mother's letter and the last line of it, which he had memorized because some things you read once and they are yours forever, don't let anyone make you small. Tomorrow, Harry said. He went back to his room and sat with the photographs for a while, and then he went to sleep, and in the dream the corridor was there and the soul fragment at the end of it was turning, slowly, toward the sound of something that had changed. Harry stood and watched it turn, and when it was nearly facing him he turned first and walked away, back toward the orange light and his parents' room, and as he walked he felt the warmth of the suppression weave's absence like the first proper breath of clean air, and his scar was warm on his forehead and his mother was laughing at something off-frame and his father was in the doorway and the word on her lips was hello, over and over, and Harry stood in the room with them and was, for the space of a dream, simply a child being loved. It would have to be enough. For now, it was. Chapter 4, Fires in the ministry. The filing happened at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, which was, as Amelia observed with the dry satisfaction of someone who appreciates symbolic timing, the day the Wiesengemot held its weekly administrative session. Ragnarok signed the Gringotts authorization at 8:45 in his office with Harry present, because Harry had asked to be there and Ragnarok had seen no reason to refuse. The quill was heavy and dark, and the parchment it moved across was not paper but something older, pressed and treated with something that made it faintly luminescent at the edges, the kind of document that existed in its own category of legal weight. Ragnarok signed without ceremony, blotted it, pressed the Gringotts seal into the wax with the focused precision of someone who has made many consequential decisions and understands that the weight of them lives in the doing and not the drama. He handed it to Shacklebolt without looking up from the desk. Amelia's other signatures? Collected as of 7 this morning, Shacklebolt said. He had the particular settled quality of someone running on purpose and not much sleep and finding the combination adequate. We're ready. Ragnarok looked at Harry. Once this is filed, it cannot be recalled, he said. It will be in the hands of the Wiesengemot by 10. By noon, at least a dozen members will know the nature of the charges. By evening, it will have reached the press. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore will respond. We don't know yet how, but he will, and he is very skilled at, Ragnarok, Harry said, gently but clearly. I know. A beat. Then Ragnarok made a sound that was as close to a conceding laugh as Harry had heard from him. Go, he said to Shacklebolt. Shacklebolt went. Harry looked at the fire in Ragnarok's grate and thought about how quickly the next few hours were going to move, and whether he was prepared for that, and concluded that prepared was not exactly the right frame. The right frame was ready, which was different, which was less about comfort and more about willingness. He was willing. That was enough. The first indication that the filing had landed came at 11:15, when a very agitated owl arrived at Gringotts' external correspondence window and was, per standing instructions, intercepted and held. The letter inside was addressed to Harry Potter, wherever he's being kept, which suggested the sender was operating with more frustration than information. It was from Molly Weasley, who Harry had never heard of, and it said, in the warm and slightly overwhelming way of someone for whom concern and instruction occupy the same emotional register, Dear Harry, I don't know if you're reading this, but I want you to know that whatever is being said right now, there are people who care about what happens to you, and you should not be making large decisions without proper adult guidance. And if you need a safe place, my home is always, and then it went on. For another 2 paragraphs that Harry skimmed with the rapidly developing ability to identify genuine warmth inside unsolicited advice. He wrote back, Dear Mrs. Weasley. Thank you. I'm safe and in good hands. I appreciate you writing. Harry Potter. He thought about it, then added, I am making decisions with proper adult guidance. The adults are just different ones than you might expect. He sealed it and gave it back to the Gringotts teller who had brought it to him. The second indication came at 12:30, when Tonks appeared in the doorway of the East Reading Room where Harry was doing a self-directed study of Goblin inheritance law, which was dense but logical, with the internal consistency of something designed by people who took agreements extremely seriously, and said, It's kicked off. Harry set down the parchment. Tell me. Dumbledore went to the Wiesengemot session this morning as usual. Chieftain's seat, the whole thing. At 10:15, the sealed filing was formally entered into the record by the clerk, which is standard procedure, except that a sealed filing bypassing the chieftain's desk also requires the clerk to notify the full chamber that a sealed filing has been entered. The room apparently went. Tonks paused, searching for the right word. Loud? Harry suggested. Seismic, she said. Dumbledore attempted to invoke his authority as chief warlock to require disclosure of the filing's contents before formal review. The clerk, who is apparently made of either iron or excellent training, informed him that the provisions governing the filing specifically preclude that. He could not see the contents until the formal review date, which was set for, she checked the parchment in her hand, 10 days from now. November 3rd. He knows the contents though, Harry said. He knows they involve him. Oh, he knows, Tonks said. He left the session early, which apparently he hasn't done in 15 years. 3 Wisengamot members contacted Amelia within the hour asking for any information she could share. One of them was on our side already. One is undecided. A pause, one is firmly in the Dumbledore camp, and the call was less a request for information and more a warning. Who? Dolores Umbridge. She's a senior undersecretary at the ministry. Very fond of Dumbledore and very fond of things being orderly on her terms. Tonks's hair shifted briefly toward a violent orange. She's going to be a problem. She doesn't know the specifics yet, but she knows enough to start making noise, and her version of noise is the kind that sounds bureaucratic until you realize it's strangling you. Harry filed Umbridge in the section of his mind labeled people who will need to be handled carefully and thought through what he knew. Dumbledore will call in favors today, he said. He'll be talking to the people who trust him, making the case that whatever this investigation is, it's politically motivated, or misguided, or based on misunderstood evidence. Harry stopped. What? Hurt, Harry said, and the word was strange in this context but felt right. He'll be genuinely hurt. Not by the investigation, by the idea that someone has gotten to me before he could. In his mind, all of this was supposed to happen in a specific order, and the order was his, and someone has scrambled it, and the thing he'll feel is, not guilt, not yet. He'll feel the way you feel when a plan you were certain about starts going wrong, and the first response to that is to find the source of the disruption and contain it. Tonks looked at him steadily. You're 6, she said, for the second time, but this time it had a different quality, less concerned, more something approaching wonder. Flintrock says I'm probably not, Harry said, which wasn't quite what Flintrock had said but was the spirit of it. What does that mean? He thinks my magical core matured unusually early, possibly because of the soul fragment. And that the suppression of it for 6 years while it was already developing, when it was released, it didn't come back at 6. It came back at where it would have been without 6 years of suppression. He said it plainly, because he'd had several days to process it, and the practical implications were more interesting to him now than the strange ones. I'm going to age into it. But right now I'm ahead of the curve, magically and cognitively, and it's going to level out eventually. Flintrock says probably by 14. Tonks thought about this. Does it feel weird? Yes, Harry said honestly. But most things feel weird right now, so it's not standing out much. She almost laughed. Come on. Amelia wants a briefing in 20 minutes and she wants you there. The briefing was in Ragnarok's office, crowded now with people Harry was starting to be able to distinguish and read, Amelia with her monocle clipped to her collar, Shacklebolt standing against the wall with his arms crossed in the stance of a man who would rather be doing than debriefing, Tonks taking up more energetic space than her physical size required, and 2 new faces. A sharp-faced woman in ministry robes who turned out to be an official records analyst named Hestia Jones, and an older wizard with a neatly trimmed beard and the permanently tired look of someone who works in law, Edmund Foley, a barrister who specialized, per the brief introduction, in Wisengamot procedure and rarely lost. Foley looked at Harry when he came in and said, without preamble, you understand you'll need to give testimony at the formal hearing. Yes, Harry said. You're 6. People keep pointing that out, Harry said. It doesn't change what I know or what I saw. It changes how it's received, Foley said, not unkindly. The Wisengamot will discount testimony from a minor. We'll need to structure your contribution carefully, you'll provide written testimony rather than speaking in the chamber, and we'll frame it as evidentiary rather than personal. The diagnostic report does the heavy lifting. Your corroboration, not the primary case. He looked at Harry steadily. Which also means you're protected. If the primary case is the documentary evidence, the diagnostic, the financial records, the detention authorization, then the burden of attacking the case falls on attacking the documents, not on attacking you. He wouldn't attack me anyway, Harry said. He couldn't. It would look terrible and it would make people start asking why he cares so much about discrediting a 6-year-old. Folly looked at him over his notes for a moment. Then he wrote something. "Good instinct," he said. "Hold on to that one." Amelia moved them through the day's developments quickly, the way she always ran meetings, forward-facing, minimal repetition, ending each point with a specific action and a person assigned to it. The Wizengamot members who had called were being managed. The press situation was developing carefully. Nothing had been officially released yet, but the sealed filing itself was a public procedural fact and at least 2 wizarding journalists were already working the story from that angle. Rita Skeeter, who Harry gathered was a reporter with the predictability of a natural disaster and about the same level of restraint, had been seen asking questions outside the ministry by noon. "We control the first real story," Amelia said. "Before she does, or before anyone does it badly. Hestia, can we get the statement ready today?" "It's drafted," Hestia Jones said. "I need Harry's sign-off." She handed him a parchment. Harry read it carefully. It was precise and restrained and presented the facts without embellishment, the enchantments found, the financial irregularities, the improper authorization of the black detention, all of it framed in legal language that was nonetheless completely clear to anyone reading it. It named Dumbledore. Directly. Without equivocation. Harry read it twice. He thought about what Flintrock had said, that the mind capable of the original act is capable of infinite reinterpretation. He thought about the statement going out and hitting the magical world and the specific kind of disruption that would follow, not just in the Wizengamot but in every household in Britain where Albus Dumbledore was as much a fixture of safety and certainty as the sun. He thought about what it would feel like to be the person responsible for that disruption, even if the disruption was necessary, even if it was right. Then he thought about Sirius Black. He signed it. The statement went out at 4 in the afternoon via official ministry press channels, which Amelia had the authority to use, which meant it couldn't be held or delayed, and by 5 o'clock, Gringotts was receiving communications at a rate that required 2 additional tellers to manage the external correspondence window. Harry was in his room reading when the first wave of it reached him in curated form. Shacklebolt came by with a summary, delivered in the economical style Harry appreciated, sitting in the single chair while Harry sat on the bed. The summary was, significant shock, some disbelief, a substantial portion of the magical community that was trying to reconcile what the statement said with their existing understanding of Dumbledore, and 2 clear camps forming fast. One that believed the evidence and was furious. One that trusted Dumbledore and was looking for an explanation that made the evidence mean something different. "What's he saying?" Harry asked. "Has he said anything publicly?" "Not yet," Shacklebolt said. "His office released a statement saying he is aware of the investigation and is cooperating fully and is confident in the ability of the proper legal authorities to reach the correct conclusions." A pause. It was gracious. "That's what's going to be hard. Whatever else you think of him, he is extraordinarily good at being gracious in difficult situations." "It's not hard," Harry said. "It's just the first move. He's buying time and he's setting himself up as someone who has nothing to hide. The next move will be," he thought about it, "he'll want to see me. He'll request a formal meeting. Possibly through the Wizengamot, possibly directly to Gringotts. He'll frame it as caring about my welfare, and it'll be genuine. He does care, in his way, but it'll also be an attempt to recalibrate things before the hearing." "And if he requests a meeting?" "We decide together," Harry said, and looked at Shacklebolt steadily. "I'm not ruling it out. Folly said his testimony might damn him better than evidence. If there's a version of a meeting where he talks and we're recording, that might be useful." He paused. "But not yet. Not before the hearing." Shacklebolt nodded slowly. He'd been building a picture of Harry since they met. Harry could feel it, the Auror's professional habit of continuous assessment, rechecking and updating as new information came in. You said you thought the most dangerous thing was that he believes he was right. Do you still think that?" "More than ever," Harry said. Because if he believed he was wrong, he'd be panicking right now. He'd be destroying evidence, calling in everything he had, doing something loud and defensive. But he's being gracious. He's cooperating. He's sitting with the absolute confidence of someone who is certain that once people understand his reasoning, they'll agree with it. He looked at Shacklebolt. He thinks he can explain his way out of this. And that means he's going to want to explain. He's going to want to sit across from someone and lay out the logic, and the logic is going to be airtight in his own terms, and he won't be able to see why it isn't airtight in everyone else's. A pause. When that conversation happens, and it will, we need to be ready for it, because it's going to be the most persuasive case against us, and it's going to come from someone who genuinely means every word. Shacklebolt looked at him for a long moment. Amelia says the same thing, he said. About him. She knows him better than I do, Harry said. You don't need to know him, Shacklebolt said. You understand him. There's a difference. He stood. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be louder. Tomorrow was louder. The Wizarding Press had the story in full by morning. The Daily Prophet ran it on the front page with a headline that Harry thought was simultaneously too large and not quite large enough for the actual news. Harry Potter found, Dumbledore implicated in enchantment scandal. Rita Skeeter, apparently moved by the same competitive urgency that drove all natural disasters, had published a competing piece in the morning edition of Which Weekly that was substantially more dramatic, substantially less accurate in its details, and substantially better at making people feel things, which Harry noted was a useful skill in the wrong hands. The Daily Prophet piece was factual and complete and written by a journalist named Barnabas Cuff, who Harry would later learn had been sitting on several years of professional discomfort with Dumbledore's increasing influence over the Ministry's narrative structure, and who wrote about the enchantments and the financial irregularities with the slightly electrified energy of someone who has been waiting for permission to say what they already knew. The Skeeter piece said that Harry had been secretly imprisoned in Gringotts, which was not accurate, and described Dumbledore as the architect of the boy who lived's carefully engineered tragedy, which was melodramatic but not entirely wrong, and concluded with a paragraph about Harry's brave, lonely struggle against institutional betrayal that made Harry read the last line twice and then set the paper down and go have breakfast. By mid-morning the Gringotts external correspondence window had received 11 letters for Harry from people he had never met, ranging from supportive to concerned to one that was simply a list of reasons why Dumbledore was definitely right and Harry was definitely confused. 2 Wizengamot members had formally announced their concern about the investigation's implications for institutional trust. 4 others had formally announced their support for a thorough and impartial review. Dumbledore's office released a second statement at noon. I understand the concern and pain that these allegations must be creating for many in our community. I want to be clear that my actions regarding Harry Potter were taken in the deepest service of his welfare and the welfare of all those he was destined to protect. I look forward to the opportunity to explain my reasoning fully to the Wizengamot, and I have confidence that a fair review will vindicate the choices I made in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. My love for Harry remains unchanged. Harry read this statement sitting in the East Reading Room with Flintrock, who had continued the daily sessions without comment on the external chaos with the professional commitment of someone who finds the external chaos less important than the work in front of them. He said destined, Harry noted. Flintrock looked up from the parchment he was annotating. I noticed. He's already framing it that way. In public. Harry thought through the implications. He's not denying the enchantments. He's not denying the money. He's saying he had a reason, and the reason was destiny, and the logic of destiny makes the methods, if not acceptable, at least explicable. He set the statement down. He's going to go to the Wizengamot and tell them about the soul fragment. He's going to tell them about Voldemort. He's going to tell them the whole prophecy, whatever that is, and he's going to make the case that everything he did was in service of the thing that was always coming. That is almost certainly his strategy, yes, Flintrock said. Then we need to know what the prophecy says before the hearing. Flintrock set down his quill. That is a more complicated matter. Tell me anyway. What Flintrock told him, over the next 40 minutes, was the shape of it, not the words, because the specific words of the prophecy were held in the Department of Mysteries in an orb that only the subjects of the prophecy could access without it destroying itself, but the general circumstantial knowledge that could be pieced together from public record and institutional memory. A prophecy made in late 1980 by a seer, received by Albus Dumbledore, concerning a child born at the end of July to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort, marked by Voldemort as his equal, the one with the power to defeat him. Harry listened and followed the logic to its end. He heard the prophecy and he went and found me, he said. And then Voldemort heard part of it. How? How did Voldemort know? Flintrock looked at him carefully. The prevailing theory, the Goblin said, choosing words with precision, is that someone was present when the prophecy was made and reported the first portion of it to Voldemort before they heard the full content. Who was present? That record is sealed in the Department of Mysteries, Flintrock said. But the investigation, Amelia's investigation, has been asking those questions. Harry sat with the shape of it. Someone had heard the beginning of the prophecy and taken it to Voldemort, setting in motion everything that followed, his parents' death, his scar, the soul fragment, 34 charms, 5 years in a cupboard, Sirius in Azkaban. A chain of consequences from a single overheard sentence, and at the link between the overheard prophecy and the death of his parents was the question of who had betrayed the Potter's location, which connected directly back to the question of the secret keeper, which connected back to the name that kept coming up in the investigation with a specific and increasing weight. Pettigrew, Harry said. The finger. The 12 Muggles. That was him, wasn't it? That was him making it look like Sirius did it. He went after Sirius and then blew up the street and left a finger and disappeared. That is the working hypothesis, Flintrock said, carefully. It is a hypothesis. We have no body, no confirmed location. But it is the scenario most consistent with the known facts. Then Pettigrew betrayed my parents, Harry said. Not Sirius. Pettigrew was Voldemort's spy and he was the secret keeper and he gave up the location, and then when Voldemort fell he staged his own death and framed Sirius for everything. He paused. And Dumbledore, did he know? The pause that followed was one of the most communicative silences Harry had experienced in his time at Gringotts, and that was saying something. There is no evidence that he knew with certainty, Flintrock said. There is circumstantial evidence suggesting he may have suspected. Suspected that Sirius was innocent. Yes. And locked him away anyway. The authorization of the extended detention does not require certainty of guilt, Flintrock said. It only requires the judgment that the individual represents a sufficient threat to require holding pending full investigation. Whether Dumbledore suspected Sirius's innocence and authorized the detention anyway, out of expediency, or because a grieving potentially unstable Sirius Black in the world created complications for his plan, we cannot say definitively. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about Sirius in the street, laughing, the day after his world ended. He thought about how Dumbledore had stood in the Wizengamot as chief warlock and signed the authorization and sent Sirius to Azkaban and then gone and sorted out the vault access and placed Harry with the Dursleys and begun, in those first months, the process of shaping the weapon he needed. We need Pettigrew, Harry said. If we can prove Pettigrew is alive, Sirius walks out of Azkaban. That's the cleanest path. Finding Peter Pettigrew after 5 years of being dead is, he's an animagus, Harry said, and this time even Flintrock went briefly still. Sirius and my father they were a group. There were stories my mother's letter touched on. They were called the Marauders and there were 4 of them and they all became animagi together, illegally, when they were teenagers, to keep Remus Lupin company. He'd thought about this in the 2 days since finding his mother's letters, turning over the pieces, seeing where they fit. If Pettigrew is alive and hiding, he's hiding as an animal. He's been an animal for 5 years. And if we know what kind of animal, do you know what kind of animal? Harry thought about his mother's letter, read it again in his memory. Sirius becomes a great shaggy dog that James says is the ugliest thing he's ever seen, and James becomes a stag, which is frankly embarrassing for an adult man, and Peter becomes the most unassuming little rat you've ever. A rat, Harry said. He's a rat. The room was very quiet. Then Flintrock, who was not an effusive being, said, "I'll get Ragnarok." The afternoon reorganized itself around this information with the quality of a map that suddenly shows a path you'd been walking alongside without seeing. Ragnarok, Amelia, Shacklebolt, Tonks, all in the office within the hour, and Harry told them what he'd pieced together, and the room did what it always did when he presented a conclusion. It got very still, and then it got busy. "We need to find a rat," Tonks said, and it should have sounded absurd but it didn't. Specifically a non-magical rat carrying a magical signature consistent with an unregistered animagus transformation. She turned to Shacklebolt. "How many rats are there in Britain?" "More than we'd like," Shacklebolt said, with the equanimity of someone saving their worry for the actual obstacles. "But the Department of Magical Wildlife maintains records of magical creature populations in inhabited areas. If there's an unregistered animagus hiding in rat form in proximity to the wizarding world, near Diagon Alley, Hogwarts, anywhere, there should be an anomalous magical signature. An animal with a magical core larger than its body warrants. How quickly can we run that check?" Amelia asked. "A week, maybe less," Shacklebolt said. "Do it quietly," Amelia said. "If Pettigrew is still in contact with anyone who's kept Voldemort's name going in the years since, and we have to assume someone is, we don't want him to know we're looking." Ragnarok looked at Harry. "You worked this out from your mother's letter." "She mentioned he was a rat," Harry said. He stopped. "I was thinking about why Sirius was laughing in the street and I thought, if Sirius was innocent, what was he actually doing there? And if he was there to find Pettigrew, because Pettigrew had just betrayed the Potters and Sirius had figured it out, and then Pettigrew saw Sirius coming and ran out of options and did the only thing that would guarantee no one believed Sirius," he shrugged. "It fits. Everything fits, if Pettigrew's the piece that's missing." "A 6-year-old, Tonks murmured, in a way that suggested she was talking to herself and had forgotten she was doing it out loud. "Tonks," Shacklebolt said. I know, she said. "I'm just processing." Amelia leaned forward. "If we find Pettigrew, alive, in animagus form, able to be restored and questioned, the case against Dumbledore strengthens significantly. Not because Pettigrew implicates him directly, but because Sirius being innocent means Dumbledore authorized the detention of an innocent man, and that is, on its own merits, stripped of everything else, a serious legal violation that no amount of greater good framing can fully absorb." She looked at Harry. "And it gets your godfather out of Azkaban." "Before the hearing," Harry said. "If we can get him out before the hearing, he can testify." "Careful," Folly said. Harry hadn't noticed him come in, which was remarkable. He moved very quietly for a man his size. An Azkaban detainee given emergency release pending new evidence review would be under significant legal restrictions on what he can publicly say before his own case is formally resolved. He can provide testimony to the investigation, but his public presence at the hearing could be challenged. "But he'd be free," Harry said. "He'd be out. That matters regardless of the hearing." Folly looked at him. "Yes," he said, in the tone of someone being reminded of something that had briefly been obscured by procedure. "It does." The days between the statement and the hearing moved with the quality of water finding its level, unstoppable, following the path of least resistance, getting everywhere. The press coverage was enormous and often inaccurate and occasionally helpful. The Wizengamot factions were hardening, 14 members firmly on record in support of a full review, 9 in opposition, the rest varying shades of waiting. Dumbledore had given one interview to the Daily Prophet in which he had been, by all accounts, magnanimous and calm and deeply worrying to Folly, who read it and circled 3 separate passages where the reasoning was so good it might move undecided members. Harry read the interview too and focused on what Dumbledore hadn't said rather than what he had, because what he hadn't said was the most important thing. He hadn't denied the soul fragment. He'd spoken about everything else in terms of protection and care and difficult choices made in the shadow of war. But the soul fragment, the most egregious element, the piece of a dark wizard's consciousness pressed against an infant's skull and left there, he hadn't mentioned it once. Because he couldn't, Harry realized. Because there was no framing of the greater good that made leaving a dark soul fragment in a baby and not telling anyone sound like love. That was the crack in his armor. Not the money, not the charms, not even Sirius. The soul fragment was the thing he couldn't explain in a way that would hold up to any kind of feeling human scrutiny, and he knew it, and so he was being gracious about everything else and hoping it wasn't the thing people focused on. Harry mentioned this to Amelia during their daily briefing on the 4th day before the hearing. Amelia looked at him for a moment and then said, "Hestia," and Hestia Jones looked up from her records. The statement for the press before the hearing, shift the emphasis to the soul fragment finding. "I want it in the first paragraph." "Done," Hestia said, and wrote something. "You're going to make him talk about it," Harry said. "We're going to make it impossible for anyone to talk about anything else," Amelia said. "And when the Wisengamot sits down on November 3rd, the first thing every member will be thinking about is a 15-month-old infant and a soul fragment, and there is not a political calculation sophisticated enough to outrun that image." Harry thought about the vote count, 14 in support, 9 opposed, the undecided middle that everything would hinge on. He thought about the soul fragment statement landing 4 days before the hearing, thought about the people in the undecided middle sitting with that image, thought about whether any of them had children or grandchildren and what the image of a 15-month-old would do to the careful political weighing they were trying to maintain. "It'll work," he said. "It might," Amelia said. "That's the best we can do in politics, put the right thing in the right hands at the right time and trust that people are fundamentally human," Harry said. She almost smiled. "Something like that." The rat was found on the 6th day, 3 days before the hearing. It was Tonks who found it, in the end, or rather, Tonks who followed the magical signature anomaly that the Department of Magical Wildlife had flagged from the inhabited area census, and Tonks who tracked it to a wizarding family called the Weasleys in a village in Devon, where a pet rat named Scabbers had been living in the household for 11 years, which was approximately 9 years longer than the standard rat lifespan and was, in retrospect, a detail that ought to have been noticed. She came back with the rat in a magically reinforced containment case, looking equal parts triumphant and unsettled, and handed it directly to Ragnarok, who handed it to Bloodstone, who confirmed the magical signature within 20 minutes, anomalous core, animagus transformation characteristics, non-standard magical tissue consistent with a human witch or wizard maintaining prolonged animal form. "It's him," Bloodstone said. Harry looked at the containment case on Bloodstone's work table. The rat inside was brown-gray and unassuming and had a slightly malformed right forepaw, missing a toe, Tonks mentioned, which matched Peter Pettigrew's staged death scene perfectly, the severed finger that had been left as evidence. The rat looked at Harry. Harry looked back and thought about how many years that thing had spent being carried around and fed and cared for by people who had no idea what it actually was, and he felt a cold discomfort that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific horror of something wearing innocence like a mask. "What happens now?" he asked. "Amelia has the legal authority under current emergency provisions to compel restoration from animagus form," Ragnarok said. "It requires a witness, a certified magical assessor, and a healer present. We have all 3. The restoration itself takes about 30 seconds once initiated." He looked at Harry. "You should not be in the room when it happens. Not for your safety, for legal clarity. Your presence during the restoration of a key witness in your own case creates a complication we don't need." Harry understood this and agreed to it, though he stood outside the door and listened, which was not precisely within the spirit of the instruction but was also not technically against it. There was a sound, sharp, organic, the sound of something fundamental changing shape, and then a silence, and then a voice, high and thin and unmistakably human and unmistakably terrified. I can explain everything. I was under, it wasn't my fault, he was going to kill me, you have to understand, I had no choice, Sirius would have, and then Amelia's voice, clear and absolutely unmoved. "Peter Pettigrew. You are under arrest for the murder of 12 muggles, the fabrication of your own death, and suspected collaboration with he who must not be named. You have the right to have a legal representative present before further questioning. Anything you say will be recorded as evidence. Do you understand?" A longer silence. Then, smaller, "Yes." Harry stepped back from the door and stood in the corridor and breathed. 3 days before the Wizengamot hearing, Sirius Black's innocence was sitting in a room, frightened and small and wearing a human face it had been hiding for 5 years, and the world was about to change again, was doing it even now, turning over into something different from what it had been this morning. He went back to his room and sat on the bed and looked at the photograph of his parents. His mother, saying hello, over and over. "Hello," Harry said back, to the moving image of the woman who had written "Don't let anyone make you small" and who had trusted the wrong man and who had died for it, and whose son was going to make sure that death meant something, was going to make sure that what had been wrong was made right, however long it took. His scar pulsed once, warm and strange, and was still. Chapter 5. The Man in Azkaban. The emergency release petition for Sirius Black went to the Wizengamot 2 days before the hearing, filed under the Emergency Wrongful Detention Act of 1897, which Folly had located in the legal archives with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been practicing long enough to know exactly where the old weapons are kept. The petition argued 3 things, in order of increasing weight. First, that Sirius Black had been held for 5 years without trial under a provision whose maximum intended duration was 6 months, making the detention technically illegal under its own authorizing statute. Second, that the primary evidential basis for the original arrest, the deaths in the Muggle Street, attributed to Black, was now materially undermined by the confirmed survival of Peter Pettigrew, whose staged death had constituted the central proof of Black's guilt. Third, and most pointedly, that the authorization of the extended detention provision had been signed by Albus Dumbledore in his capacity as Chief Warlock, and that Dumbledore was now himself the subject of a formal investigation, making the chain of authority behind the detention demonstrably compromised. It was, Folly said when he handed Harry the draft to read, about as clean a legal argument as he'd produced in 30 years. Harry read it and said, "When do we know if it's granted?" "The Wizengamot has 48 hours to respond to an emergency petition," Folly said. "Given the circumstances, given that Pettigrew is alive and in ministry custody and that fact alone makes Black's conviction structurally impossible to maintain, I expect a response before the 48 hours are up." "And when he's out," Harry said, "what state will he be in?" Folly paused in a way that was careful. 5 years in Azkaban is, he stopped. Started again. The physical effects are manageable. Healers can address those fairly quickly. The psychological effects are less predictable. Some people come out of Azkaban very damaged. The Dementors don't hurt people in the obvious way. They just drain everything good out of you, repeatedly, day after day, until the only thing left is the worst version of your own history. He looked at Harry steadily. "He will know you, in all likelihood. He will understand what's happened. But he may not be fully himself for some time." Harry thought about this. "I want to see him before the hearing," he said. "Not to talk about the case. Just to see him. So he knows someone came." Folly opened his mouth and then closed it again, in the way of someone who had a procedural objection and then looked at the face of the 6-year-old in front of him and decided the procedural objection could manage itself. "I'll arrange it," he said. The response to the petition came in 26 hours, faster than the 48-hour limit, which Amelia said was significant, meaning there was enough support on the Wizengamot to move quickly rather than letting it sit in the contested middle. The emergency release was granted. Sirius Black was to be transferred from Azkaban to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries immediately, held there under medical supervision pending the formal hearing in 2 days, at which point his case would be reviewed in full. Amelia told Harry at breakfast. Harry ate his toast and didn't say anything for a moment and then said, "Today? He'll be at St. Mungo's by noon," she said. Harry looked at his plate. The feeling in his chest was not one he had a good name for, it was the feeling of something that should have happened years ago finally, slowly, beginning to happen, and the combination of relief and grief that came with understanding that years ago was not now and could never be recovered. Sirius Black was coming out of Azkaban today. He'd been in there since Harry was 15 months old. He was going to come out into a world where he'd lost 5 years and his best friends were dead and the child he was supposed to have raised was 6 and had been through things that took Harry himself several hours to fully describe. "Can we go today?" Harry asked. "To St. Mungo's." "This afternoon," Amelia said. "Ragnarok has arranged transport. I'll be with you. And I need to warn you, Harry, St. Mungo's has its own press now. There are journalists outside the hospital. The story of Pettigrew being alive broke this morning." "How bad?" "Loud," she said. "But manageable. We go in through the private entrance. You won't need to speak to anyone." Harry nodded and went back to his toast and thought about what you said to someone you had never met but who was your family, who had been away for 5 years in the worst place imaginable, who was coming back to find the world rearranged around a 6-year-old who had taken it apart and put it back differently while he was gone. He didn't think you said anything planned. He thought you just showed up. St. Mungo's was a department store in appearance and a hospital in reality, which struck Harry as a very magical solution to the problem of hiding medical facilities in plain sight. The window display, he noticed as they went around to the private entrance, featured a collection of unmoving mannequins in formal wear that managed to look both entirely mundane and faintly wrong in a way that Muggles would probably attribute to the general uncanny quality of mannequins. Inside, the private entrance deposited them in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic charm and something herbal and sweet, with healers in lime green robes moving with the specific purposeful pace of people whose workday was defined by other people's urgent problems. A healer named Strout met them at the corridor junction, young, competent-looking, with the careful warmth of a medical professional delivering information they know is heavy. She spoke to Amelia first, quick and clinical, stable, conscious, oriented to place and time, severely malnourished but responding to nutritional charms, some hypothermia from the stone cell, the expected markers of prolonged dementor exposure which meant emotional flatness, occasional gaps in recall. An overall presentational quality she described as significantly diminished from baseline while her face said something more distressed than the clinical language allowed. Then she looked at Harry. "He knows you're coming," she said. "I told him." She stopped. "He asked me to describe what you looked like, and I told him, and he didn't say anything for about 2 minutes and then he asked if you were all right." Harry absorbed this. "What did you tell him?" "I said you seemed to be doing very well, under the circumstances." "Good," Harry said. "That's accurate." The room was at the end of a quieter ward, separated from the general noise of the hospital. Amelia stopped at the door and looked at Harry. "I'll be right outside," she said. "Take whatever time you need. There's no rush today." Harry looked at the door. It was ordinary, pale green, institutional, with a small glass panel at head height that was too high for him to see through. He thought about Flintrock, who had told him facts. He thought about Ragnarok, who had been steady and direct and treated him like someone whose life was his own. He thought about his mother's letter, "The most loyal person I know," and about the photographs, his father and Sirius probably side by side through years of their lives, the kind of friendship that becomes structural, that becomes load-bearing in the architecture of a person. He pushed the door open and went in. The room was small and hospital clean, the light gentle and artificial, the window showing a charmed outdoor scene, a garden, quiet, something soothing and deliberately ordinary. There was a bed, and in the bed was a man who was hard to look at directly, not because he was frightening but because he was so clearly the outline of a person rather than the person themselves, the way a drawing in pencil is the same image as a painting but missing the thing that makes it live. He was thin in a way that went deeper than weight, the kind of thin that speaks to years rather than weeks, and his hair was long and dark and uncombed and his face was, Harry looked at the face, and the face was looking back at him, and the eyes were gray and alive and that was the part that mattered, that was the part that was still there, still him, Still the person who had been in the street 5 years ago laughing because what else do you do when the world ends? Harry walked in, and the man on the bed pushed himself upright, slowly, like moving hurt a little, and looked at him, and said nothing. Harry stopped at the end of the bed and looked at him back. "Hi," Harry said. The man swallowed. His throat moved. "Hi," he said, in a voice that was rough with disuse and something else, something that came from the chest. "You have," he stopped. "Tried again. You look exactly like James. Except the eyes." "I've been told," Harry said. "Lily's eyes," Sirius said, as if he were telling himself something he already knew but needed to say out loud to make it real. They were the same color as, he stopped again. His hands were on the blanket in front of him and they were not entirely steady. Harry came around the side of the bed and sat in the chair beside it. Close enough to be present, not so close as to be presuming. He looked at the hands, the unsteadiness in them, and thought about 5 years in a stone cell with dementors eating every good memory you'd ever had, day after day, and decided that unsteady hands were an entirely reasonable response to that and said nothing about them. "Did they treat you all right?" Harry asked. Is there anything you need right now?" Sirius looked at him in a way that suggested this was not the question he'd expected from a 6-year-old, and Harry supposed it wasn't the most conventional greeting but it seemed more useful than the alternatives. They've been decent, the healers. I had soup earlier." He said soup in the tone of a man rediscovering it as a concept. "How are you?" They said you'd found." He paused, visibly working to organize what he knew, and Harry could see the gaps the dementors had left, the slightly longer pauses where retrieval should have been immediate. "You went to Gringotts on your own. You were 6 and you walked into Gringotts." "I followed something," Harry said. "An instinct. It pointed the right direction. James used to say your mother had the best instincts of anyone he'd ever met," Sirius said, and the present tense slipped into past in the middle of the sentence and he felt it happen and his face did something that he controlled before it fully arrived, the practiced management of someone who has spent years in a place where letting grief in fully would have been the end of him. He was right, obviously. He was usually right about Lily. Annoying about most things, right about her. He looked at Harry, the gray eyes steady, and there was something in them that was working very hard and succeeding. The loyalty his mother had described, Harry thought, not a quality so much as a structure, something internal and load-bearing that 5 years of dementors had gnawed at but not broken. Harry, I should have found you. I don't know why I didn't. When he fell, I went after Peter instead of going to you and I've thought about that every day you didn't know where I was," Harry said. "They'd put me with the Dursleys the night before. You couldn't have known. And then you were arrested, so." He said it plainly, because it was the plain truth, and because Sirius didn't need to be managed, he needed the facts laid out without the fog of blame that the dementors had probably been cultivating. "It wasn't your fault. None of it was your fault. We know that now." Sirius was quiet for a moment. The garden scene in the window moved gently, a breeze through imaginary leaves. "They tell me Pettigrew is in custody," he said. "Yes. Alive." "Yes." Something moved through Sirius's face, complex and rapid, too many things arriving at once, the same problem Harry had had in the diagnostic room when the third suppression wave came out. Too much, all at once, after years of it being forcibly absent. He looked at the window for a moment and Harry sat with him in the silence and didn't fill it, because some silences were doing important work. "I want to know everything," Sirius said finally. "What you found out. What happened. All of it." He looked at Harry. Are you willing to tell me?" "Yes," Harry said. "But not all today. You've just gotten here and there's a lot and some of it is," he stopped. "Some of it is hard. About your parents, and mine. About what was being planned and what was done. It's a lot to receive when you've just been through what you've been through." Sirius looked at him with an expression that Harry had a hard time reading, which was unusual, but he thought it had something to do with the gap between 6 and adult, the disorientation of receiving careful, considered emotional management from someone who should, by any conventional measure, be the person being managed. "You're very," Sirius started, and then stopped, and tried again. "You're not what I pictured you as a baby," he said. "Obviously. I didn't imagine, a small adult?" Harry suggested. "Yes," Sirius said, and to Harry's considerable relief, the corner of his mouth moved. Small, tentative, the first edge of something that would eventually be what his mother had described as Sirius Black's particular brand of chaos in human form. But there. Alive. James would have found this either wonderful or deeply unfair, I can't decide which. "Both, probably," Harry said, and Sirius made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that Harry counted it. They sat for an hour. Harry told him the outline: Gringotts, the diagnostic, the enchantments, the financial case, the legal proceeding, and Sirius listened with the focused, slightly uneven attention of someone working around the gaps, asking brief questions that told Harry he was tracking it, keeping it organized, the fundamental sharpness of his mind present even under the damage. When Harry got to the soul fragment, Sirius went very still and said nothing for a long time, and Harry let that be what it was too. "She knew something was wrong," Sirius said, not quite to Harry. "Lily. She always said, in the last months she said there was something she couldn't see clearly, something she didn't trust. James told her she was being paranoid. I said we should listen to her." He stopped. "Dumbledore told her everything was in hand." Harry nodded. "And she trusted him because," Sirius's jaw tightened, "because that's what the loyalty hexes did. Made it easier to defer to someone confident and apparently well-intentioned. Even if you were Lily Evans and your instincts were the sharpest in the room." He looked at Harry. "Were the hexes in her too?" Harry hadn't known to ask that question. He felt the shape of it land, the specific new horror of it. If Dumbledore had put loyalty hexes in Harry, had he put them in his parents too? Had the trust that led them to rely on him, to take his counsel, to accept his plans, been manufactured? Harry didn't have an answer. He put it in the problem-to-be-examined pile, which was still growing even now. "I don't know," he said honestly. Sirius absorbed this. He looked at the window. "Harry," he said. "What I want you to know, right now, before the hearing, before whatever happens next, is that I would have found you. If I'd been free. However long it took, wherever they'd put you. I would have found you. I want you to know that was always the intention." Harry looked at him. He thought about the cupboard, and the beans, and the bread heel, and all the years of being managed and small and shaped. He thought about what it would have been to grow up with someone who had loved his parents, who had been chosen for him, who would have fought for him. He thought about the version of himself that might have existed under those circumstances, and whether that version was a better version or just a different one, and decided that that kind of thinking was less useful than what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was a man who was damaged and thin and had spent 5 years in the worst place imaginable and had, on the day after his world ended, gone after the person who had betrayed it rather than saving himself. Who had been in the street, not running, not hiding, but going after Peter, because the loyalty his mother had described was not a feeling but a practice, and the practice was, you do not let the wrong go unanswered, you do not let the people you love be unavenged, you do not run. Harry thought, "This is my family." "I know," Harry said. "I know you would have." Sirius looked at him for a long moment, the gray eyes doing something complex and private. Then he nodded once, carefully, the way you handle something fragile that you're relieved is still intact. "So," he said. "Tell me about this hearing." Harry told him. Sirius asked sharp questions and made sharp observations and twice suggested tactical angles that Harry hadn't considered, and by the end of the hour Harry was fairly certain that 5 years in Azkaban had diminished Sirius Black's physical state considerably and his fundamental capabilities not at all, which was both reassuring and, in a way he'd think about later, one of the more moving things he'd witnessed in his 2 weeks at Gringotts. When Harry got up to leave, Sirius caught his wrist, not restraining, just catching, the gesture of someone who has something left to say and isn't sure how. Harry waited. "Your mum," Sirius said. She would have loved this. You. She would have been absolutely beside herself." He stopped. "I mean that. She'd have been terrified and furious about everything that was done to you, and then she'd have looked at who you are and she'd have cried, probably, and then she'd have started organizing everyone immediately." He almost smiled. She was very good at organizing everyone. Harry thought about the photograph. His mother saying hello on the floor of a room lit orange, laughing at something off frame. "I got her letter," he said. "Someone sent it. Signed with M." Sirius looked like something slotted into place. "Minerva McGonagall," he said. "She and your mother were close. She kept some things." He paused. "What did she say?" "If you don't mind." Harry told him the last line. "Don't let anyone make you small." The silence in the room was warm, not heavy. "That's Lily," Sirius said, quietly. "That's exactly Lily." He looked at Harry. She was right. Obviously. Outside the room, Amelia was leaning against the wall reading parchments, which Harry suspected was less idle corridor waiting and more Amelia being constitutionally unable to exist without processing documentation. She looked up when Harry came out. "How is he?" she asked, and she asked it like a person, not like an official. "Sharper than expected," Harry said. "I think the Dementors had to work very hard." He thought about the corner of Sirius's mouth moving, the almost laugh, the way the gray eyes had been there, present, thinking. "He'll be all right." Amelia nodded. She had the expression of someone managing relief professionally. "The hearing is in 2 days," she said. "I want to go over your written testimony today, just to be sure we have it right. And Folly needs an hour with you tomorrow on procedure." She started walking. Harry fell in beside her, matching her pace, which was brisk. Dumbledore filed a motion this morning to delay the hearing by 30 days, citing the need for adequate preparation time to respond to the charges. Was it granted? Harry asked. Denied, Amelia said, with the crisp satisfaction of someone delivering good news. The presiding member on the petition, Augusta Longbottom, she's been on the Wisengamot for 30 years and has no particular fondness for procedural delay as a delaying tactic, denied it inside an hour and added a note that the evidence had been substantially available to the respondent since the original filing, making the 30-day request inconsistent with the stated rationale. Harry thought about Augusta Longbottom and made a note to find out more about her. What does Dumbledore do now? He prepares his defense, Amelia said. Which, based on his public statements, is going to be the greater good argument, presented as carefully and compellingly as he is capable of presenting it, which is, she paused, and in the pause was the honesty of someone who has been doing this for 20 years and has no patience for underestimating an opponent, extremely capable. He will stand up in that chamber and he will be sincere and he will be brilliant and he will have people in that room wondering if they've made a terrible mistake. We need to be ready for that. I've been ready for that, Harry said. Since the first week. Amelia glanced at him sideways as they walked. The long corridor of St. Mungo's moved around them, healers and patients and the ordinary urgent business of a hospital. I know you have, she said. The day before the hearing, Harry asked Ragnok to take him to his parents' vault. He'd been to the trust vault twice now, for practical reasons, school supplies that Flintrock had recommended, a set of robes that actually fit, books. But he hadn't been to the main Potter family vault, the one that the discretionary holding structure had been drawing from for 5 years. He asked Ragnok and Ragnok looked at him steadily and said, Why? Because it's mine, Harry said. And I want to see what it is. Before tomorrow, before everything, I want to see it. Ragnok took him himself. The cart ride down was the first properly magical thing Harry had experienced that was purely, uncomplicatedly wonderful. The speed of it, the depth, the way the darkness of the tunnels opened onto brief glimpses of cavern and firelit stone, the physical sensation of going very fast in a direction you trusted because you were in the hands of something ancient and reliable. He gripped the cart edge and felt the wind and thought, "This is mine. This world. I belong here." The vault was large. Not cartoonishly large, not absurdly large, but the vault of a family that had been significant and established for centuries, deep, stone-walled, the gold in neat stacks that glowed warmly in the lamplight. There were other things too, beyond the money, shelves against the far wall with objects arranged with the care of someone who understands that some things are worth more than their material value. A box of letters, tied. Several books with protective charms on them, older than anything Harry had seen in the Gringotts reading room. A set of photographs in frames that moved when Harry picked them up, his grandparents, he thought, and their parents, and further back, a line of people with his hair and various versions of his eyes going back further than he could comfortably track. And at the back of the shelf, alone, a small package wrapped in cloth, which he unwrapped carefully. Inside was a cloak. Fine, silver-gray, with a texture that was unlike anything he'd felt before, light, almost weightless, like holding fabric woven from breath. He shook it out carefully. It shimmered. "What is this?" he asked Ragnok, who had come in after him. Ragnok looked at the cloak, and something moved in his expression that was several things at once: recognition, caution, something that looked almost like deliberate restraint. "That is an heirloom of the Potter family," he said carefully. "It has been in the vault for several generations. I would recommend studying its properties carefully before making use of it." Harry looked at the cloak. The way it moved in his hands, the way the light went through it and didn't come back. "It's an invisibility cloak," he said. "Among other things, possibly," Ragnok said, and closed his mouth on any further elaboration with the precision of someone who has decided how much to say and is sticking to it. Harry folded it and wrapped it back in its cloth and held it, and thought about his father, who had been an animagus and had apparently run around with this cloak being endearingly reckless with his best friends, and whose son was standing in his vault the day before testifying against the most powerful wizard in Britain, holding an inheritance he'd never been told existed. "Can I take it?" Harry asked. "It is yours," Ragnok said simply. Harry put it under his arm and looked at the vault one more time, the gold, the books, the photographs of people he was descended from and had never known, and then he turned and walked back to the cart. The night before the hearing was quiet. Harry sat in his room with the cloak on the bed beside him and went through his written testimony one more time, not because he'd forgotten it but because reading it once more felt like a way of being certain of it, of making it fully real before it became public. The testimony was careful, factual, and devastating in the understated way of documents that don't need to be dramatic because the facts are doing all the work. Bloodstone's diagnostic report was attached. The financial records were attached. The detention authorization bearing Dumbledore's signature was attached. Harry read to the end and set it down and looked at the sky window. He thought about the hearing, and what Dumbledore would say, and how it would feel to be in the same proceeding as the man who had decided what Harry's life was worth before Harry had any opinion on the matter. He thought about Sirius in St. Mungo's, recovering, present, alive. He thought about his parents' vault and the long line of people with his hair in frames that moved. He thought about the soul fragment, which was still in his scar, still quiescent, still the last and largest problem, the one Bloodstone hadn't yet attempted, the one that would require a ritual preparation and a settled magical core and significant planning. It hadn't been forgotten. It was waiting, the way certain problems wait when you've correctly identified that other problems need to be addressed in the right order. He pressed his palm against the scar. It was warm. Just warm. In the dream that night, the corridor was different. Shorter. The thing at the end of it felt the difference, felt the absence of 34 charms and 6 suppression weaves and the changed landscape of Harry's magical core, and it turned toward him with a kind of orientation that was less than communication and more than nothing. Harry stood in the corridor and looked at it, really looked at it, without turning away this time, because he'd decided tonight that he was done being afraid of what lived in his own head. What he saw, when he looked, was smaller than he'd expected. Diminished. The fragment of a person who had spent decades destroying themselves pursuing something that couldn't be held, and what was left of them was this, a cold, lonely, disoriented piece of something that had once been a person and was now mostly the memory of what it had wanted to be. I know what you are, Harry thought, not speaking aloud in the dream, just thinking it clearly, addressing it the way you address something that is real and present and not to be treated as more than it is. I know what you were. I know what happened to you. I'm going to get you out, and you can't stop it, and then you'll be nothing, and that is the end of the story. The fragment was still. Harry thought it might have understood. Or might have felt the intention regardless of the words. He turned and went back to the warm orange light and sat with his parents, and when he woke the morning was clear and grey and the hearing was in 4 hours. He got up. He got dressed. He put his mother's letter in his inside pocket, because he had decided she was going to be there in whatever way was available to her. He put on Dudley's old shoes, the newspaper-stuffed ones, because in the 2 weeks at Gringotts he had acquired proper clothes and proper books and a proper room but hadn't thought to replace the shoes, which struck him suddenly as funny, the image of Harry Potter showing up to testify against Albus Dumbledore in shoes 3 sizes too large stuffed with newspaper. He went and found Ragnarok and said, with the ghost of something that was going to be, eventually, a proper sense of humor about his own situation, I need different shoes. Ragnarok looked at the shoes. Something moved in his expression. Sharpfang, he said. Sharpfang appeared, looked at the shoes, said nothing with the perfection of someone who has decided that certain situations speak for themselves, and went. Proper shoes arrived inside 15 minutes. Harry put them on. They fit. The ministry atrium was loud and crowded and wrong-scaled in the way that powerful bureaucratic spaces are always slightly wrong-scaled, designed to make the individual feel appropriately small. Harry walked through it with Ragnarok on one side, Amelia on the other, Shacklebolt and Tonks a step behind, and Folly moving slightly ahead, cutting the crowd, and the crowd parted, partly because Ragnarok was the director of Gringotts and that carried significant practical authority, and partly because the story had been in the papers for 2 days now, and there was not a person in the atrium who didn't know who Harry Potter was and what he was here to do. People looked. Harry let them look. He was 6 years old in new shoes, and he was walking into the ministry with goblins and aurors at his back, and he was about to change the shape of something fundamental, and the only thing he felt, checking in with himself the way he always did, quick and regular, was ready. He thought, Mom, I'm not making myself small. And then he walked through the doors and into whatever came next. Chapter 6, The Scar and the Choice. The Wizengamot chamber was older than the ministry building that contained it. That was the first thing Harry noticed, the way the stone of the walls was a different color and texture from everything around it, darker, more settled, the stone of something that had been standing for centuries before someone had built the rest of the building around it the way you build a house around a hearth. The benches rose in tiers around a central floor space, the wood worn smooth and dark with use, and the ceiling was a dome of charmed glass showing the actual sky above London, which on a grey November morning gave the whole space a flat serious light that was better suited to what was happening here than any theatrical alternative would have been. The benches were full. Harry had expected attendance. He hadn't quite expected this, every tier occupied, members in their plum-colored Wizengamot robes sitting shoulder to shoulder, and in the gallery above them, packed with observers who had no vote but considerable opinion, a noise that was the composite sound of several hundred people managing anticipation. The gallery quieted when Harry's group entered, which was a particular kind of quiet, not the respectful kind, not the shocked kind, just the kind that happens when the person everyone has been discussing for 2 days walks into the room and the abstract becomes concrete. Harry walked to the witness table in the center of the floor with Folly beside him and did not look at the gallery and did not look at the upper tier where Dumbledore would be seated, because he had decided in advance that he would do those things in his own order, not in the order the room's gravity dictated. He sat down. The chair was sized for an adult. He sat in it anyway. Folly leaned close. You know the procedure. The presiding member reads the charges. Each side presents evidence in order. Your written testimony is already in the record, you don't have to speak unless directly addressed. If you're addressed, answer clearly and briefly and don't elaborate unless I indicate. I know, Harry said. And don't look at him until you're ready. I know that too. Folly sat back. Harry looked at the tabletop, good grain, old wood, the surface of something that had held a lot of weight over a lot of years, and breathed once, slowly. Then he looked up. The presiding member was Augusta Longbottom, and she was magnificent in the way that certain people are magnificent, not through performance but through density, through the quality of being entirely, immovably themselves. She sat in the presiding chair with the settled authority of a cliff face, her hat ferociously decorated and her expression ferociously composed, and when the chamber quieted to its working level she looked around at once with grey eyes that said, plainly, I have been doing this for 30 years and today will be conducted properly or we will all sit here until it is. The chamber chose proper. She read the charges in full. They took 4 minutes, and the chamber got quieter as she read, not louder, the specific silence of people absorbing something that is larger than they had understood when they came in this morning. The enchantments. The financial irregularities. The unauthorized detention authorization. And at the end, added per Folly's filing amendment 48 hours ago, the confirmed survival of Peter Pettigrew and the resulting material question regarding the basis of Sirius Black's detention. Harry looked at the plum-colored robes and the tears while Augusta read, and he watched people's faces, and he was learning to read the room the way he'd learned to read the rooms at Privet Drive, quickly, precisely, tracking the tells. There was a woman in the 4th tier with round-lensed spectacles and a smile that didn't quite work as a smile, which was umbrage, he assumed, because she had the expression of someone who has prepared several devastating counterarguments and is waiting impatiently for her turn with them. There were 3 members in the upper tier who were watching Dumbledore's section of the bench rather than looking at Augusta, which meant they were looking for cues from him, which meant they were his. Harry finally looked at Dumbledore. He was, Harry realized with a start, exactly as you'd imagine him from everything everyone had said, tall, long-bearded, with half-moon spectacles and a robe in midnight blue embroidered with silver that ought to have looked theatrical and instead just looked like something he'd had for decades and was entirely comfortable in. He sat in his bench with his hands folded and his expression open and attentive, the expression of someone who has come to engage in good faith, and his eyes, when they met Harry's, because Dumbledore had clearly been waiting for Harry to look, were blue, and sharp, and complicated. What Harry saw in them, in the fraction of a second before the eyes moved professionally away, was not guilt, and not calculation, and not the performance of innocence. What he saw was something closer to pain. The genuine, undefended pain of someone looking at a thing they love that has been, in their view, misunderstood. Harry looked away. He'd seen what he needed to see. Amelia presented the case with the focused precision of someone who had spent 2 weeks building something and knew every joint and was confident in every one of them. She went in the order they discussed, tracking charms first, documented and certified by 3 independent assessors whose statements were read into the record, each charm's design and origin traced as far back as the evidence allowed. She walked the chamber through the timeline, charm by charm, the accumulation of them, the maintenance of them, the 2 fresh ones applied within the last year to a child living in a non-magical home in Surrey who had no idea they were there. The chamber was very quiet for the tracking charms. It was quieter for the loyalty hexes. By the time Amelia reached the suppression weaves, the one on the pathways associated with seeking help from trusted adults, the quality of the silence had changed, become something more like the silence before weather. Then she got to the soul fragment. Harry watched the chamber during this section. He'd been watching during all of it, but this was the section he'd been watching for. Amelia read Bloodstone's findings on the soul fragment in the full clinical language of the diagnostic report, anomalous magical signature, non-native, consistent with fragmented soul construct anchored to the scar tissue, present since approximately 15 months of age, maintained in active state through, here was the part, the part Harry had been building toward, maintained in active state through deliberate non-intervention by an individual or individuals aware of its presence and electing not to pursue removal. Not an accident. Not an oversight. A choice. Someone knew it was there and chose not to remove it. The chamber didn't make a sound. In the front row of the gallery, Harry heard someone make a sound that was not a word. In the tiers, 3 different members had stopped looking at Dumbledore entirely. Umbridge's smile had stopped working at all now. Augusta Longbottom looked at the parchment in front of her, and then at Amelia, and said, in a voice that gave away nothing, Healer Bloodstone's report was submitted in full to the record 48 hours ago and has been available to all chamber members for review? It has, Amelia confirmed. And the 3 independent assessors were, Healers Armand Laurent of the Swiss Institute of Magical Medicine, Priya Kapoor of St. Mungo's Forensic Enchantment Unit, and Goblin Healer Feldspar of Gringotts Institute of Magical Analysis. Amelia paused. All 3 confirmed Bloodstone's findings in full. Augusta nodded once. Continue. The financial evidence took 40 minutes, and Folly presented this section, because financial argumentation was his particular art form, and he moved through the records with the unhurried certainty of someone who has spent 30 years making complex things legible to large rooms. He showed the estate maps, the ones Harry had looked at with Flintrock, the before and after, the attenuated lines, the secondary node with no family name sitting outside the structure and drawing from it steadily. He showed the withdrawal orders with Dumbledore's signature, 14 of them over 5 years, each in the range that didn't individually trigger an audit flag, cumulatively representing an amount that did. He showed the note, expenditures made in service of the boy's ultimate welfare and the welfare of all those the boy will one day protect. He let the chamber sit with the handwriting. Then he showed the detention authorization, Sirius Black, November 2, 1981, signed by Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock, authorizing extended detention without trial under the emergency provisions. He showed the statute. He showed the maximum 6-month duration. He showed the date of this hearing, 5 years and 1 week after the authorization was signed. The extended detention provision, Folly said, into the chamber's silence, was designed for use in extraordinary circumstances, for a maximum extraordinary duration. It was not designed to be forgotten. It was not designed to remove from our system, permanently and without review, an individual whose guilt has not been established by any formal legal process. He looked at the tiers. Peter Pettigrew is alive. He is in ministry custody. He is the man whose staged death was the primary evidence against Sirius Black. His survival renders the basis of the original arrest structurally invalid. A pause. Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 5 years for a crime that the evidence now suggests he did not commit. And the authorization that kept him there bears the signature of the man seated in this chamber today as respondent. Folly sat down. The chamber noise was not dramatic, no gasps, no outcry. It was subtler than that. It was the sound of a very large number of people recalibrating simultaneously, the cognitive hum of established beliefs being held up to new light. Harry watched Dumbledore. He was sitting with his hands still folded, his expression still open and attentive, and underneath it, Harry watched very carefully, there was something that was not the pain from before. This was something more careful, the expression of someone who has just heard the full case laid out and is now moving decisively into the part where they respond to it. Not panicking. Not defensive. Ready. Harry thought, here it comes. Dumbledore spoke for 45 minutes. He was everything Amelia had warned and Folly had planned for and Harry had understood from the beginning. He was sincere. He was clear. He was, in the way of people whose intelligence is the kind that can make any framework internally consistent if they commit to it, completely coherent. He acknowledged every element of the evidence presented, didn't deny the charms, didn't deny the financial decisions, didn't deny the detention authorization. He acknowledged all of it and said, in a voice that was warm and serious and the voice of someone speaking the most important truth they know, I made choices. Yes. I made choices that I knew would cause Harry pain, that I knew would limit his freedom, that I knew would cost him things he deserved to have. I made them with full knowledge of their cost, and I made them because the alternative was this boy's death, was everyone's death. He looked at Harry, and the look was, Harry had braced himself for this, had prepared for what it would feel like to have this man look at him with genuine love and genuine belief in the rightness of what he'd done, and it was still harder than he'd expected. Not in the way that made him doubt. Just hard, in the way that true things that are also terrible are always hard. Harry Potter was born carrying a piece of the darkest magic this world has ever known. I could not tell him. I could not tell anyone, because the moment the fragment became known, it became a target, for Voldemort's remaining followers, who would have tried to reclaim it, and for well-intentioned individuals who would have tried to destroy it by methods that would have destroyed Harry along with it. He looked around the chamber. I placed tracking charms to ensure his safety. I placed the suppression weaves to protect him from the influence of the fragment during his most vulnerable years. I placed him with his mother's blood family to maintain the sacrificial protection that stood between him and anyone who wished him harm. He paused. The money I used from the estate went to fund the continued monitoring of Voldemort's remaining network, to maintain the protections around Godric's Hollow as a memorial site, and to support research into the question of the soul fragment, research that I was conducting privately because the moment it became public knowledge, Harry would have been in danger from a dozen directions. He looked at his hands for a moment. As for Sirius Black, if he is truly innocent, I am grateful. Genuinely. But I must be honest, on the 1st of November, 1981, I had two imperatives. Get Harry to safety. Contain the threat that had just destroyed the most important protective structure in the war. I made a judgment call under conditions of extreme uncertainty, and if that call was wrong, then I accept that weight. I have accepted it every day for 5 years. The chamber was absolutely still. Dumbledore looked at Harry one more time. I love this child, he said. I have always loved him. Everything I did because I believed, I know, that it was the only path to a world where he gets to live in it. He sat down. The chamber exhaled. Harry counted, 3 of the undecided members had visibly moved in the chamber's body language. 2 of them toward Dumbledore. 1 of them hadn't moved at all, staring at the tabletop in front of them with the expression of someone in genuine, unresolved conflict. 12 votes. They needed 12. Harry looked at Folly. Folly was already writing. The chamber took a recess of 30 minutes, and during it the noise in the gallery was like a marketplace, loud and directional, everyone processing and debating, and Harry sat at the table with Folly and Amelia and Ragnock and said, quietly, he moved 2 of the undecided. I know, Amelia said. Her voice was controlled. He was magnificent. I told you. It's not enough, Ragnock said. Not yet. But it's close. He looked at Harry. The undecided middle is where this goes. There are 7 members still unresolved. We need 8 of the undecided 14 to hold, we had 12 coming in, we may have lost 2. We need 9, Harry said. We need 9 of the remaining 12 to hold. Yes. So the question is, Harry said, whether Dumbledore's argument works on the undecided or whether it works only on the people already inclined toward him. Correct. Harry looked at the chamber. He thought about what Dumbledore had said, and the way he'd said it, and the specific frame he'd built, the greater good, the impossible choice, the love that justified the cost. It was the most coherent version of the argument possible. It was also, Harry thought, the version of the argument that only works on people who haven't sat in a diagnostic chair at age 6 and felt 34 charms come out of their body. I want to speak, Harry said. Folly looked at him. That wasn't the plan. I know. I want to speak. Harry looked at him steadily. Not testimony. I want to respond to what he just said. Directly. In the chamber, not in writing. You're 6 years old, Folly said. The chamber will, some members will discount it on that basis alone. The ones who will discount it are already counted, Harry said. They're already his, or they're already ours. It's the undecided I need, and the undecided are people in genuine conflict right now. They heard him say he loves me and they heard him say everything he did was for me, and they are sitting there trying to reconcile that with 34 charms and 5 years in a cupboard, and the only person who can help them reconcile it, or not reconcile it, is me. He looked at Folly. I'm the only person in this room who can say what it felt like. And that's the thing the argument doesn't account for. He built a beautiful case for why it was necessary, and he never once said what it was like to be the person it was being done to. Because he can't say that. He doesn't know. The silence at the table. Then Ragnarok said, Augusta Longbottom has the discretion to permit witness testimony beyond the submitted record if she judges it materially relevant. Folly looked at Harry for a long time. Then he looked at Amelia. Then he stood up. Let me go talk to Augusta, he said. He came back with 6 minutes of recess left. She'll allow it, he said. 5 minutes. You address the chamber standing, not from the chair. You speak to the charges directly, she won't allow it to become personal or political. Stick to the evidence. Stick to your experience as it relates to the evidence. He paused. Harry. You don't have to do this. I know, Harry said. The recess bell rang. When Augusta Longbottom announced that a supplementary witness statement would be heard before the deliberation period, the gallery noise went up and then came down sharp when she looked at it. The chamber looked at the table in the center, and Harry stood up from it and walked to the speaking point on the floor where witnesses stood, and the chamber looked at him. He was small. He knew he was small, this was a fact, not a problem. He stood in the center of the chamber and looked up at the tiers and thought about the suppression weaves, the ones that had been telling him for 6 years to manage himself, to be small, to not make himself visible in his need, and he thought, not anymore. He looked at the undecided members, the ones whose faces told him they were still working it out. Dumbledore said he loves me, Harry said. I believe him. The chamber had expected many things. This was apparently not one of them. I believe he loves me, Harry said again, because it was true and because saying it was not conceding anything, it was setting the right foundation. And I believe he thinks everything he did was for me. I believe that completely. He paused. The problem is that none of the decisions he made were things he asked me about. Not because I was too young to have a view, he didn't ask, and then he made sure, with the suppression weaves, that I wouldn't think clearly enough to form one. He looked at the chamber steadily. He decided what I was. He decided what I was worth. He decided what was acceptable to do to me and what I could be expected to endure, and he made all of those decisions alone, in private, and then he put 34 charms in me to make sure I couldn't think clearly enough to question them. And then he calls that love. The chamber was very still. I don't think it isn't love, Harry said. That's the part that's hard. I think it is love. I think he loves me the way you love something you've decided the shape of, something you've looked at and thought, I know what this is, I know what this is for, and I know what price it can be asked to pay. And that kind of love is the most dangerous thing I can imagine, because the person who loves you that way will sacrifice everything to protect you, including your right to decide what you're willing to sacrifice. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking back at him. The blue eyes were, something Harry hadn't seen in them before. Something that wasn't the open, attentive, good-faith expression of a man presenting his case. Something that was listening. Actually listening, in a way that suggested the words were arriving in a place he hadn't prepared. He said the soul fragment couldn't be disclosed because it would have put me in danger, Harry said. He said the charms were for my protection. He said the money was for my welfare. He has a reason for every single thing he did, and every reason involves protecting me, and none of them, Harry stopped, not for effect but because the next thing was the true center of it and he wanted to say it exactly right. None of them ever required my knowledge or my consent, because the plan only works if I don't know I'm in it. A weapon that knows it's a weapon asks questions. A sacrifice that knows it's a sacrifice looks for alternatives. So he kept me small and quiet and shaped, and he kept me not knowing, and he told himself it was love, and the only difference between that and what he says he was protecting me from, he stopped. The chamber was holding something it hadn't held before, a collective breath. The difference between that and Voldemort, Harry said quietly, is that Dumbledore meant well. That's the only difference. Both of them decided what I was worth. Both of them made plans that used me as a piece. One of them wanted to use me to destroy the world. One of them wanted to use me to save it. And neither of them asked me. The silence was total. Harry looked at the chamber, at the undecided members, at the people in genuine conflict, and he said the last thing, I'm 6 years old. I've been in Gringotts for 2 weeks. I learned to read estate maps and I found the man who staged death put my godfather in prison and I'm standing in the Wizengamot and I'm asking you to understand that none of this should have been mine to do. Someone should have asked me, and instead they decided for me, and that is the thing this chamber needs to decide about, not whether the decisions were good ones, but whether any person, no matter how wise, no matter how well-intentioned, has the right to make them for someone else without consent. He paused. He doesn't. Nobody does. He walked back to his seat. The chamber exhaled. In the tiers, the undecided members were no longer looking at each other. They were looking at their tables, at their hands, at the middle distance where you look when something has just arrived and you're deciding where to put it. Folly was looking at his parchment but not writing anything. Ragnarok was looking at Harry with the expression he had when he was recalibrating, which happened less often now but still happened when Harry surprised him. Harry sat down and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the front of the chamber and waited. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Harry was escorted to a waiting room with Ragnarok and Amelia and Folly and Shacklebolt and Tonks, and the waiting room had tea, which Harry drank, and a window, which he looked out of, and silence, which no one tried to fill because everyone in the room understood that 40 minutes of this was better managed with quiet than with speech. Tonks changed her hair 3 times, brown, red, something indeterminate, and then seemed to notice she was doing it and stopped. Shacklebolt stood against the wall. Folly made brief notes on parchment that Harry thought were less about the case and more about the activity of note-making. Amelia sat with her hands around her tea and looked at the window. Ragnarok sat beside Harry and said nothing for 38 minutes, and then said, quietly, whatever the vote, what you said in there was right. You know that. I know, Harry said. And whatever the vote, the investigation continues. The evidence doesn't change with the vote. I know, Harry said again. Then, what do you think the vote is? Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. I think, he said, that you said the one thing he could not prepare a defense against. Harry thought about Dumbledore's face when he'd said the only difference is that Dumbledore meant well. The something that had arrived in the blue eyes that wasn't the practiced open expression. The actual listening. The moment when a man who had been entirely certain of his own framework encountered the framework's limit. He understood it, Harry said. He heard it. I could see him hear it. Yes, Ragnarok said. That will be harder for him than losing the vote. The door opened. Folly was on his feet before anyone else. Amelia set down her tea. Harry stood up. The clerk in the doorway had a face that gave away nothing, which was the face you wore when you were carrying a result and your job was to carry it neutrally. The chamber has reached a determination, the clerk said. Will you return? They returned. The vote was 18 in favor of the investigation's findings, 11 opposed, 9 abstentions. Of the 38 full Wizengamot members present, 18 had voted to formally uphold the investigation's findings, refer the financial misappropriation to the full legal proceedings, and vacate the authorization of Sirius Black's extended detention, effective immediately. 11 had voted against. 9 had abstained, which was not a victory for Dumbledore and was not a complete victory for them, but was 9 people who had been pushed far enough off their original positions by what they'd heard today that they couldn't vote either way, and that, Folly said quietly as Augusta Longbottom read the determination, was its own significant thing. The full legal proceedings against Dumbledore were formally initiated. His positions, Chief Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, were suspended pending resolution, the suspension carrying its own immediate political weight. The financial misappropriation would go to a separate hearing. The question of the unauthorized enchantments would go to the full criminal proceeding. And Sirius Black's detention was vacated. The chamber noise when Augusta finished reading was loud and directional, and Harry sat at the table in the center and felt the sound wash over him and thought, simply, he's free. Dumbledore crossed the chamber floor as it was emptying. Harry saw him coming and didn't look away. Ragnarok moved incrementally, which was the closest Ragnarok got to a protective stance, and Harry put a hand out briefly, "It's okay," and Ragnarok stopped. Dumbledore stopped in front of the table. He looked at Harry, and what was in his face was the continuation of the thing Harry had seen during the speech, the actual listening, the thing that had arrived that he hadn't prepared for. He looked older, somehow, than he had when he walked in. Not broken. Not finished. Just, arrived somewhere new, and knowing it. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. "Not an explanation." "You heard the explanation." "An apology." Harry looked at him steadily. "Okay," he said. I still believe the danger was real," Dumbledore said. "I want to be honest with you. I have not stopped believing the choices were necessary. But what you said," he stopped. Something moved through his face. "What you said about consent. About the difference between love that asks and love that decides. I will need to think about that for a very long time." "I know," Harry said. "You are not what I expected," Dumbledore said, and the words had the quality of an admission rather than a compliment, something costing him to say because it implicitly acknowledged that the expectation was wrong, and the expectation being wrong meant the entire architecture built on it was built on wrong foundations. "I expected a child. Someone I could guide." "You expected someone who didn't know," Harry said. "Someone who would go where you pointed and be grateful." He paused. "I'm still a child. I'm just one who knows." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The blue eyes were doing the complicated thing that Harry had thought, when he first saw them, was pain. He understood it better now. It wasn't pain exactly. It was the experience of a person encountering the full human reality of someone they'd been treating as a concept, a symbol, a piece in a plan, and finding that the human reality was so much more and so much other that the framework couldn't hold it, and having to decide, in real time, what that meant for everything they believed. He didn't think Dumbledore had finished deciding. He wasn't sure Dumbledore ever would. "Be safe, Harry," Dumbledore said. "Not I'll guide you, and not the plan still stands, and not any of the things he might have said if he hadn't been listening. Just, be safe." As if, stripped of the strategy and the greater good and the careful architecture of his intentions, what was underneath was something much simpler and much less useful. Just, be safe. The prayer you say when you've run out of plans. "I'll try," Harry said. Dumbledore nodded once and walked away, and the chamber continued emptying around them, and Harry watched him go and felt, not triumph, not relief, not even the satisfaction of something finished. He felt the weight of it. The specific weight of a problem that had been solved in some dimensions and remained entirely unsolved in others. Dumbledore was not going to prison today. The criminal proceedings would take months, years, and the outcome was uncertain and would involve lawyers and evidence and the kind of slow institutional grinding that ate things whole. The soul fragment was still in his scar. Voldemort was still out there in some form, diminished and waiting. Nothing was finished. But something was different, in the way something is different when you've cleared the ground, not built anything yet, just cleared it, removed the things that were in the way, and now the space exists for something that wasn't possible before. Harry got up from the table and walked back across the chamber floor to where Ragnock and Amelia were waiting, and Shacklebolt, and Tonks, who had her hair at a color Harry thought was probably involuntary and corresponded to relief, and Folly, who was capping his quill with the air of a man who has completed an important document and is satisfied with the work. 3 days later they went back to St. Mungo's. Sirius Black was actually dressed, in real clothes that fit, a dark shirt and plain trousers, and the thinness was still there but the flatness in the eyes was less, replaced by something more alive, more variable, more like a person in motion rather than a person surviving. He was sitting up in the chair by the window when Harry and Ragnock came in and he looked at Harry and said, "They told me what you said in the chamber." "Good," Harry said. "You called it," Sirius said. "Everything you told me in the hospital, the strategy, the direction, what was going to work and what wasn't. You were right about all of it." He looked at Harry with something that was part disbelief and part something warmer. "I keep trying to do the math and I keep coming up short." "You're 6. Everyone says that," Harry said, sitting down in the other chair. "It's relevant. I know it's relevant. It stops being the most interesting thing about the situation after a while." Sirius looked at him and made the sound that was almost a laugh, and this time it was closer to the real thing, fuller, warmer, with the undertone of something that had been real once and was working its way back. "You sound like your mother," he said. She had that same, when someone was stating the obvious she had this way of acknowledging it and moving on that made you feel both heard and gently redirected. It's uncanny. Harry thought about his mother saying hello in the photograph, over and over. "I got her letter," he said. "The one she wrote when I was 3 months old." Sirius's expression shifted. "What did she say?" "That you were the most loyal person she knew." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window the garden scene moved, the imaginary leaves settling into an imaginary November stillness. "She said that," Sirius said. "She said you and my dad were competing for the title since you were 11, Harry said. She seemed to think my dad was also a strong contender." Sirius looked at the window and said nothing for a moment, doing the thing Harry had seen him do before, managing the arrival of something large and limited available space, sorting it while it was in motion. "Then, he would have been so proud of you. Both of them. James would have been impossible to live with, he'd have been telling everyone, constantly, his son told off the chief warlock of the Wizengamot at age 6, former chief warlock, Harry said. "Former chief warlock," Sirius said, and this time the laugh was real. Brief, rough with disuse, but real. He'd have been insufferable. Lily would have pretended to be embarrassed and secretly she'd have been exactly the same. He looked at Harry. "I should have been there for all of it. I should have been there from the beginning." "You're here now," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "That's very forgiving." "It's not forgiveness," Harry said. "You didn't do anything. None of it was your fault." He paused. "I'm not going to spend the time we have now being upset about the time we didn't. That's not useful." He looked at Sirius directly. "But I'd like to not be in a bank forever. At some point I'd like somewhere to actually live. And I'd like it to be with family." The silence was different this time. "The legal case for formal guardianship," Ragnock said from his position near the door, with the impeccable timing of a being who has been waiting for the right moment, "is straightforward once Sirius's case is formally resolved. The Wizengamot vacated the detention. The criminal proceeding, with Pettigrew in custody, should reach a resolution within 60 days under expedited review." He paused. "Once that resolution is obtained and the formal guardianship is established, the Gringotts custody provision would naturally give way to the family arrangement." 60 days, Sirius said. "Approximately," Ragnock said. Sirius looked at Harry. 2 months, he said. And then I have a home," Harry said. Something crossed Sirius's face that didn't have a good name but was one of the largest things Harry had seen since coming to Gringotts, the full weight of 5 years of loss and grief and the grinding wrongness of Azkaban meeting the sudden, real, present possibility of something on the other side of it. It was too much for one expression to hold and it didn't try, it moved through his face like weather, complicated and honest, and Harry sat with it and let it be what it was. "You'll have a home," Sirius said. His voice was slightly unsteady and he didn't appear to be concerned about that. That's the plan." In October, 6 weeks after the hearing, Peter Pettigrew's interrogation, conducted under Veritaserum in front of 5 Wisengamot members and 2 independent legal assessors, with Folly present on Harry's behalf, yielded a full confession. The actual secret keeper. The actual betrayal. The staged death. 12 Muggles whose deaths were entirely Pettigrew's own act, not Sirius's. All of it, every piece, spoken in the flat precise voice of Veritaserum and recorded to parchment that would be in the legal record for as long as records were kept. Sirius Black was formally exonerated on a Tuesday. The announcement was made publicly at noon. By 2 o'clock there were celebrations in Diagon Alley. Harry was in his room at Gringotts reading about Goblin metallurgical history, which was genuinely interesting and was something he'd never have read if he hadn't spent 8 weeks at Gringotts, when Shacklebolt knocked and came in and said, simply, "It's done." Harry set the book down. "He's free." "He's free," Shacklebolt confirmed. Harry sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Can we go tell him?" "He already knows," Shacklebolt said. "He's been notified." "But yes." He said to come. Harry put on his shoes, his own shoes, the right size, and his jacket and picked up his mother's letter from the desk, folding it into his inside pocket the way he did when he went anywhere important now, and went out into the corridor. The soul fragment removal happened in December, 2 days before Christmas. Bloodstone had been preparing for 3 months, longer than the initial estimate, because the more settled Harry's core became the more precisely the healer could map the fragment's integration with the surrounding tissue, and the more precise the map, the safer the removal. It required 3 goblin healers, a ritual circle prepared with materials Bloodstone had collected from 4 different countries, and Harry sitting in a chair in the center of it with his eyes closed and his palms flat on his knees. Sirius was outside the door. He'd asked to be in the room and Bloodstone had explained, with characteristic precision, exactly why that was medically contraindicated, and Sirius had listened and agreed and then been outside the door for the entire 3.5 hours of the ritual anyway, which was, Harry thought, exactly the right thing to do. The removal was the strangest thing that had ever happened to him, and his standard for strangeness had risen considerably in the last 4 months. He felt the fragment wake when the ritual began, not with intention, not with the faceless turning of the corridor dream, but with something more like a startle, the way a sleeper moves when something in the room changes. He kept his back to it, mentally, the way he'd practiced in dreams for months, turned away, grounded in himself, not engaging. And then the healer's working reached it, and it knew what was happening, and in the final moment before the extraction Harry felt something from it that he would have difficulty describing afterward, not a message, not words, not really an emotion in any human sense. Something more like the last impression of a candle going out. The shape of heat without the heat. The fact of something that had been, ending. It left his scar like exhaling. The warmth went out. His scar went cold for about 30 seconds, which Bloodstone had warned him about, and then it settled, still there, always going to be there. The mark itself was physical and the curse that made it had done its work 20 years ago and no healing removed that. But the consciousness behind it, the cold alien presence, the small lonely thing that had been pressed against the inside of his thoughts since he was 15 months old, gone. Harry opened his eyes. The ritual circle was dim. The healers were watching him. "Done?" he asked. "Done," Bloodstone confirmed. "How do you feel?" Harry checked in with himself, quick, regular, the practice he'd been doing all his life, the compass reading. He felt clear. Not different in a dramatic way. Just clear, in the way that you don't know something has been there until it isn't, in the way that 34 charms coming out had felt like cotton wool lifting from his ears, but deeper. Quieter. More completely, entirely himself than he'd ever been. Good, he said. I feel good. He went out into the corridor and Sirius was leaning against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes on the door, and when Harry came out those eyes moved to his face immediately, reading it. Okay? Sirius asked. Yes, Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a moment with the grey eyes that were fully his own now, not the flat Azkaban eyes but the ones that were alive and variable and sharp. Then he uncrossed his arms and said, "Come on then." Ragnar's office. Christmas planning. Harry fell in beside him. Christmas planning. Apparently there are traditions, Sirius said, with the energy of someone who has been doing research and is slightly overwhelmed by their findings. Wizard Christmas traditions I should be aware of. Gravelstone mentioned something about an ancient Potter family practice involving something. I didn't entirely follow the explanation. Something about a fire and a toast and a specific kind of mead. Gravelstone would know, Harry said. Gravelstone knows everything, Sirius said. It's slightly unnerving. In a wonderful way. They walked down the corridor, and the flameless lamps were steady in their niches, and the stone was old and settled and reliable, and Harry walked through it knowing that in 3 days he was leaving Gringotts for the first time in 4 months to see the house Sirius had been approved to rent in Hogsmeade, a proper house, with proper rooms, with space enough for 2 people to be a family rather than a plan, and everything ahead of him was uncertain and complicated and unresolved in all the ways that lives were unresolved, and the criminal proceedings against Dumbledore were ongoing, and Voldemort was still out there in some form, still waiting, still the long problem on the horizon that hadn't gone away, and Harry was 6 years old and had a new home and a godfather who had come back from the worst place anyone could go and was currently researching Christmas traditions at the suggestion of a 1,000-year-old goblin. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the edge of his mother's letter. Don't let anyone make you small. He wasn't small. He was 6 and he wasn't small. He was 6 and he had cleared the ground and the space ahead was his own and the people beside him were real and chosen and the choices going forward were going to be his, made with his own eyes open and his own judgment unclouded and his own compass pointing at whatever was actually north. He thought about the dream, his parents in the warm orange room, his mother on the floor, his father in the doorway. He thought about them watching him do this. He thought about how they would have felt about the last 4 months, about Ragnar and Bloodstone and Flintrock and Sirius and Amelia, about the hearing in Dumbledore's face when something arrived in his eyes that he hadn't prepared for, about Pettigrew's confession and Sirius walking out of his tea. Mungo's in proper clothes with a look in his grey eyes like a man who has come back from somewhere and hasn't entirely processed the distance yet. He thought his mother would have cried, probably. And then organized everyone. He thought his father would have been impossible to live with. He thought they would have been proud. And then the corridor ended and the door to Ragnar's office was ahead, and Sirius opened it and inside was firelight and Ragnar behind his desk and Gravelstone in the corner with the ancient settled patience of someone who has seen centuries and found them all interesting, and the sound of Flintrock in heated debate with Folly about something procedural that was probably theoretical at this point but was clearly being argued for the pleasure of the argument, and the familiar maps on the walls. And the annotated margins of 500 years of institutional memory. Harry walked in. The door closed behind him. Outside, London was cold and grey and getting on with itself, and in the Wisengamot chambers the proceedings were ticking through their slow legal clock, and in the ministry Umbridge was writing memos that would cause problems in the future, and in some cold and lightless place Voldemort was waiting, patient, for the moment when the world remembered him. All of that was real. All of that was coming. Harry knew it. But right now there was a fire, and people he trusted, and Christmas 3 days away, and a house in Hogsmeade that was going to become home, and the weight of 34 tracking charms and a soul fragment he'd never asked to carry gone from his body for the first time in his life. Right now, it was enough. More than enough. It was the beginning.